Try to imagine that if humans had evolved even slightly differently, we might not exist at all. If our brains had grown a little slower, if our bodies had adapted a little less efficiently, if the climate had shifted at the wrong moment, our species would have disappeared quietly, just like many other human species before us. Human evolution was not a careful process of improvement. It was a narrow path surrounded by extinction. Most human species did not fail because they were weak or stupid. They failed because the world changed faster than their bodies could follow. The traits we call human today did not appear because they were the best possible traits. They appeared because they happened to work just long enough. When we look at human evolution closely, we do not see a straight line from animal to modern human. We see interruptions, dead ends, and entire ways of being human that vanished without a trace. Our fragile bodies, our restless minds, and our constant sense of unease are not accidents of modern life. They are the result of a long evolutionary process that never promised stability or meaning. If survival was never about becoming better, only about lasting a little longer than others, then what does the real story of human evolution actually tell us about who we are and why we are here at all? Human evolution is often described as if it began with an intention, as if nature somehow knew where it was going. But the first and most important thing to understand is that evolution never tries to create anything in particular. There is no goal hidden inside it, no future it aims to reach. Long before anything resembling a human existed, life on Earth was already changing endlessly, not because it wanted to improve, but because it had no choice. Small variations appeared by chance. Some survived a little longer, others disappeared without leaving a trace. This process did not speed up when our ancestors appeared, and it did not slow down to protect them. The environment did not care what lived within it. Climate shifted, food sources vanished, landscapes transformed, and every living creature was forced to respond, not intelligently, but blindly. When the earliest human ancestors emerged, they were not stepping onto a path meant for them. They were stumbling into a temporary opening created by changing conditions. If that opening had closed a little sooner, or a little later, there would be no humans at all. Evolution did not plan for upright walking, larger brains, or complex social behavior. Those traits appeared because something else stopped working. Forests thinned. Trees became harder to rely on. Movement across open ground became necessary, not advantageous, just necessary enough to survive. At this point, human evolution was already shaped by loss rather than progress. Each adaptation was a response to something that was no longer available, food that could no longer be reached, shelter that no longer existed, safety that could no longer be assumed. This is where the real process begins. Not with improvement, but with constraint. Every trait that followed was shaped by what had been taken away, not by what could be added. This matters because it explains why human evolution feels unstable from the very beginning. Our ancestors were not optimized for a future world. They were patched together for a present that kept collapsing. A slightly different climate pattern, a different predator, or a longer drought would have erased them completely. There was nothing inevitable about survival. Even when early human ancestors managed to persist, they did so on the edge of disappearance. Evolution did not protect them once they appeared. It continued experimenting, producing multiple human species at the same time, most of which would later vanish. From the start, being human meant existing in a narrow space between survival and extinction. This narrowness shaped everything that came next. It forced trade-offs instead of solutions. It produced bodies that worked just well enough, not bodies that worked well. It created minds that reacted quickly but struggled to rest. These outcomes were not signs of a successful design, they were signs of a system that never stopped adjusting to pressure. When we trace human evolution back to its earliest moments, we do not find a beginning filled with promise. We find a beginning defined by uncertainty, by environments that changed faster than bodies could adapt, by survival that depended on timing rather than strength. This is why the story of human evolution cannot be told as a steady rise. From the very first step, it was unstable, contingent, and reversible. The fact that we exist now does not mean the process worked. It only means it has not ended yet. And this brings us back to the core of the question implied by the title of this story. If human evolution was never trying to create humans, and if our existence depended on conditions that almost failed repeatedly, then understanding how it actually happened requires us to stop looking for intention and start looking at pressure, loss, and chance as the real forces that shaped our beginning. One of the reasons human evolution is so often misunderstood is because the human mind is drawn to lines, sequences, and destinations. We prefer stories that move forward, that start at a point of weakness and end at a point of strength. When we look back at our past, it feels natural to arrange it as a climb, from something primitive to something advanced. But this way of thinking does not come from evolution itself. It comes from us. Evolution does not recognize beginnings or endings. It does not separate past from future. It only reacts to what is happening now, when early human ancestors changed. They were not moving closer to becoming human in the modern sense. They were simply responding to immediate pressure. If standing upright reduced energy loss under the sun, it remained. If it did not, it would have disappeared. The same applies to every trait we later described as progress. Larger brains were not selected because intelligence was valuable in some abstract way. They persisted because, in certain moments, they helped solve specific problems, and when they stopped being helpful, they became a burden. This is why evolution cannot be read backward as a plan that led to us. We exist at the end of the story only because we are the ones telling it. If another human species had survived instead, their bodies and minds would appear just as inevitable to them. This is a crucial point. The appearance of inevitability is an illusion created by survival. Everything that disappeared feels irrelevant only because it is gone. But during most of human evolutionary history, nothing about our lineage stood out as destined. There were long stretches of time where early humans were not expanding, not improving, and not thriving. They were simply not extinct yet. Population sizes remained small. Geographic ranges were limited. Survival often depended on fragile balances that could collapse with a single environmental shift. When we imagine evolution as a ladder, we ignore how often that ladder breaks. We also ignore how many branches never led anywhere. Evolution produces abundance, not refinement. It creates many variations at once, most of which never last. The few that do survive are not necessarily better. They are merely compatible with a narrow set of conditions that happen to persist. This is why calling human evolution a success is misleading. Success suggests intention, evaluation, and reward. None of those exist in natural selection. What exists is repetition without memory. The same pressures can eliminate a species again and again without learning from the past. When early human ancestors adapted, those adaptations did not accumulate toward a stable form. They layered on top of one another, sometimes in conflict. Traits that solved one problem often created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. Over time, this produced bodies that were efficient in some contexts and fragile in others, minds that were flexible but prone to distress. None of this was corrected, because there is no correcting force in evolution, only continuation. When we place ourselves at the center of the story, we overlook how narrow the conditions for our existence really were. A different migration route taken by prey animals, any of these could have erased the lineage that led to us. The fact that they did not does not make the outcome meaningful. It only makes it visible. Understanding how human evolution actually happened requires letting go of the idea that it was moving toward something. It was moving away from failure, step by step, without knowing where that movement would end. And it is this constant retreat from extinction, rather than any forward march toward greatness, that defines the true beginning of our species. To understand how human evolution actually happened, we need to end this first section by placing humans back into the larger process they came from, without exception or privilege. Evolution did not slow down when our ancestors appeared, and it did not narrow itself to focus on them. It continued unfolding everywhere, producing countless forms of life, most of which had no connection to what we would later call humanity. Early human ancestors were not standing apart from this process. They were immersed in it, vulnerable to the same forces that shaped and erased every other species. What separated them was not direction, but circumstance. Their survival depended on remaining just compatible enough with an environment that refused to stay still. This compatibility was always temporary. Every gain came with a weakness that could later become fatal. Upright walking freed the hands but exposed the spine. Larger brains improved problem-solving but demanded enormous energy. Social dependence increased survival but created prolonged vulnerability. None of these traits resolved pressure. They redistributed it. Evolution did not weigh these outcomes and choose the best combination. It simply allowed whatever did not collapse immediately to continue. This is why there is no stable point in human evolution, no moment when the process reached balance. Even the earliest forms of our lineage were already unstable arrangements of compromises. Their existence depended on conditions aligning just well enough for just long enough. When those conditions shifted, many lineages vanished without warning. They left no message behind, no lesson learned by evolution. Their disappearance did not improve the process. It merely reduced the number of remaining experiments. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, this pattern was already deeply established. Survival was never guaranteed, and extinction was never dramatic. Most human species did not end because of a single catastrophe. They faded as their adaptations slowly fell out of sync with their surroundings. The same risk applied to our own lineage, and it still does. The fact that we remain is not evidence of completion. It is evidence of delay. When we look back and search for a moment where humans became inevitable, we are searching for something that never existed. There was no threshold crossed, no point of no return. At every stage, the possibility of disappearance remained open. Human evolution did not close options behind it. It carried instability forward. This is why many of the tensions we experience today feel unresolved. They are unresolved because they were never meant to be resolved. Evolution does not finish its work. It abandons it. The human body and mind are not final versions. They are temporary configurations shaped under pressure that has not stopped applying force. Recognizing this changes the meaning of our origin. It shifts the focus away from achievement and toward fragility. It reminds us that being human was never a destination reached, but a condition maintained moment by moment against forces that could still undo it. This understanding does not diminish human evolution. It makes it honest. It allows us to see the beginning of our story not as the start of something destined to succeed, but as the continuation of a process that never promised survival to anyone. And with this perspective in place, we can now move forward into the next part of the story. Not searching for progress, but observing how environment, pressure, and chance slowly shaped the earliest ancestors who would later be called human. Human evolution did not begin with a change in the body. It began with a change in the world. Long before the first traits we recognize as human appeared, the environment that shaped earlier primates started to shift in quiet but relentless ways. Forests that had once provided food, shelter, and safety slowly fragmented. Seasonal patterns became less predictable. Rainfall changed its rhythm. What had been stable for long stretches of time became uncertain. These changes were not dramatic in a single moment. They unfolded over thousands of years, which made them even more dangerous. Slow change does not trigger immediate adaptation. It forces species to survive, while conditions gradually move away from what their bodies were built for. Early human ancestors did not respond to this shift because they understood it. They responded because they had no alternative. As tree cover thinned, relying solely on climbing and fruit for survival became less reliable. Food was no longer always above. It was scattered across open ground. Moving between resources required traveling longer distances under direct sunlight, exposed to predators, without the protection that dense forests once offered. This was not an opportunity. It was a problem that demanded a response. The environment was no longer matching the bodies that existed within it. And when this mismatch occurs, evolution begins to push, not toward improvement, but toward tolerance. Traits that allowed individuals to endure heat slightly better, to walk a little farther, or to conserve energy under scarcity began to matter more than traits that once defined success in the forest. This is how environmental pressure works. It does not ask what would be useful in the future. It only punishes what no longer works in the present. Early human ancestors were not evolving toward humanity. They were being stripped of options. Each environmental shift narrowed the range of behaviors that could sustain life. Climbing became less effective. Remaining stationary became more dangerous. Dependence on a single food source increased the risk of starvation. The environment forced movement, flexibility, and endurance before it ever rewarded intelligence. This is why the story of human evolution cannot start with the brain. It must start with the landscape. The open environments that replaced forests did not favor specialization. They favored generalists, creatures that could survive on varied diets, adjust their movement patterns, and tolerate exposure were more likely to persist. This persistence was not success. It was resistance to disappearance. The earliest changes in the human lineage reflect this resistance. Bodies that could remain upright for longer periods reduced heat absorption. Longer legs improved energy efficiency over distance. These traits did not make life easier. They made survival possible under worsening conditions. And even then, survival remained fragile. Environmental pressure did not stop once these traits appeared. It continued to fluctuate, creating cycles of expansion and contraction that repeatedly tested the limits of adaptation. Many early human populations likely vanished during these cycles, leaving no record behind. What we see in the fossil record is not a continuous line of progress, but a scattered pattern of appearances and disappearances shaped by shifting environments. Each appearance represents a moment where conditions aligned just enough for survival. Each disappearance represents a failure to keep pace with change. This constant instability shaped the foundation of human evolution. It ensured that no trait, no behavior, and no body plan could ever be considered final. The environment was always one step ahead. And because of this, early human evolution was reactive rather than creative. It did not invent new ways of being. It adjusted existing ones under pressure. Understanding this changes how we interpret every trait that follows. Upright walking, tool use, social cooperation, and eventually language all emerged within a context defined by environmental uncertainty. They were not steps upward, they were responses outward, stretching the limits of what bodies could endure as the world continued to move beneath them. This is where the real process begins, not with intention, not with intelligence, but with an environment that refused to remain compatible with the creatures living inside it, forcing the earliest ancestors of humans to survive by adapting just enough for just long enough to remain present. As the environment continued to change, it did not do so in a single direction. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of early human evolution. Climate did not simply become drier or hotter or colder in a steady way. It oscillated. Periods of relative stability were interrupted by sudden shifts. Wet landscapes turned arid. Open grasslands briefly gave way to scattered woodlands, only to disappear again. For early human ancestors, adaptation was never a finished task. It had to be repeated again and again, often before previous changes had fully settled into the body. This constant fluctuation created a unique kind of pressure. Traits that worked well in one phase could become liabilities in the next. A body well suited for long-distance movement might struggle when resources clustered again. A dietary flexibility that helped during scarcity could become inefficient when food became abundant. Evolution offered no protection against this instability. It did not preserve useful traits for future conditions. It only tested them against the present moment, then discarded them when circumstances shifted. This meant that early human populations were repeatedly pushed to the edge of collapse. Survival was not a matter of adapting once, but of remaining adaptable under conditions that refuse to stay consistent. This is why early human evolution shows so many starts and stops. Fossil evidence suggests periods where certain human forms spread successfully, followed by sharp contractions or disappearances. These were not failures of intelligence or effort. They were mismatches between bodies and environments that changed faster than biological traits could adjust. Climate variability acted like a moving target. Every adaptation lagged behind it. This lag shaped the character of human evolution in a profound way. It favored traits that allowed short-term flexibility over long-term specialization. Bodies that could tolerate a range of conditions, even imperfectly, were more likely to persist than bodies optimized for a single stable environment. Generalist traits are rarely efficient. They trade precision for survival across uncertainty. Early humans paid this cost continuously. Energy efficiency, reproductive success, and physical resilience were all compromised in different ways, but these compromises allowed populations to endure fluctuations that eliminated more specialized species. Importantly, this endurance was not guaranteed. Many early human groups likely survived only a few thousand years before disappearing. The environment did not reward persistence with permanence. It simply allowed survival to continue until conditions shifted again. Instead of evolving toward a single ideal form, early human ancestors carried forward a collection of imperfect solutions, each one shaped by a different set of pressures. Some traits overlapped, others conflicted. None resolved the underlying problem of environmental unpredictability. This is why early human evolution appears uneven and fragmented when examined closely. There is no smooth progression from one form to the next. There are gaps, overlaps, and abrupt transitions that reflect environmental volatility rather than biological intention. Climate change did not guide evolution toward humanity. It destabilized the conditions under which any form could remain fixed. This forced the human lineage into a constant state of adjustment. Movement patterns shifted. Diets expanded and contracted. Social structures likely reorganized repeatedly as groups responded to new pressures. Each response left traces in the body, but none brought closure. Understanding this helps explain why human evolution produced so many incomplete forms rather than a single, refined outcome. The environment never stayed still long enough for refinement to occur. It demanded response, not optimization. And because of this, early human evolution must be understood as a process of continuous disruption. The world changed first. Bodies followed imperfectly. Survival occurred in the space between those two speeds. This space was narrow, unstable, and unforgiving. Yet, it was within this space that the earliest foundations of the human lineage were laid, not because they were strong, or clever, or destined, but because they remained just flexible enough to endure a world that never stopped shifting beneath them. As environmental pressure continued to destabilize the lives of early human ancestors, something important became clear. Bodies change slowly. The world does not. When climate, terrain, and resources shifted faster than biology could follow, survival began to depend less on physical transformation and more on behavioral adjustment. This was not a conscious decision. It was a necessity forced by timing. Genetic change requires generations. Environmental disruption can happen within a lifetime. Faced with this mismatch, early humans could not wait for their bodies to evolve new solutions. They had to respond immediately, using whatever flexibility already existed. This is where behavior became a critical buffer between the body and the world. Movement patterns changed before leg structure fully adapted. Diets diversified before digestive systems specialized. Social arrangements shifted before brains increased significantly in size. These behavioral responses did not replace biological evolution. They delayed its consequences. They bought time. In unstable environments, buying time can mean the difference between survival and extinction. Early human groups that could alter where they traveled, what they ate, and how they cooperated were more likely to endure periods of stress. Those that could not adjust behaviorally were filtered out before biology had any chance to catch up. This dynamic shaped the trajectory of human evolution in a subtle but powerful way. It meant that many key features of our lineage did not begin as physical traits, but as patterns of action. Flexibility in foraging, reduced dependence on a single food source, shifting group sizes allowed adaptation to changing resource availability. Temporary shelters and shared protection reduced exposure to predators without requiring immediate anatomical change. These behaviors left no direct fossil record, but they influenced which bodies survived long enough to reproduce. Over time, biological traits that supported these behaviors became more common. This reversal challenges the idea that human evolution was driven primarily by physical innovation. Instead, it suggests that early humans survived by stretching the limits of existing traits through action rather than waiting for new ones to appear. This strategy carried risks. Behavioral flexibility can reduce immediate pressure, but it can also mask underlying biological vulnerability. A body that survives through behavioral compensation may never fully adapt structurally. This creates long-term instability. Many traits in the human lineage reflect this tension. Our bodies often rely on learned behaviors to function effectively within environments they are not fully suited for. This reliance began early. It is not a modern condition. It is embedded in the way human evolution unfolded under environmental stress. The more unpredictable the world became, the more valuable behavioral adaptability grew. But this adaptability did not eliminate pressure. It redistributed it. Stress shifted from physical limitation to cognitive demand. Survival required constant attention, learning, and adjustment. This placed increasing load on neural systems that were still evolving. It also increased dependence on social learning, imitation, and shared knowledge. Individuals alone could not track all the changes. Groups became essential units of survival, not because of morality or altruism, but because pooled behavior extended adaptability beyond the individual body. Not a moment when humans became human, but a moment when survival began to depend on something more fragile than muscle or bone. It depended on coordination, memory, and response to uncertainty. These qualities were not guaranteed advantages. They required energy. They increased vulnerability. They introduced new forms of failure. Time to persist while bodies lagged behind the world. By the end of this phase, early human evolution had already taken on its defining shape. It was no longer driven solely by slow physical adjustment to a stable environment. It was driven by rapid behavioral response to instability. This did not solve the problem of survival. It postponed it, and in doing so, it set the stage for everything that would follow: the expansion of the brain, the deepening of social dependence, the growing distance between biological design and lived reality. All of these later developments rest on this early imbalance between environmental speed and biological change. Human evolution did not begin by becoming better suited to the world. It began by learning how to survive in a world that would not slow down long enough for bodies to catch up. The shift to walking upright is often described as one of the great achievements of human evolution. It is usually presented as a clear advantage, a turning point that set our ancestors on a path toward dominance. But this interpretation looks backward from the present, rather than forward from the past. When upright walking first appeared, it was not a breakthrough. It was a compromise forced by a changing environment. Early human ancestors did not stand up because it made life better. They stood up because remaining low to the ground no longer worked as reliably as it once had. As forests thinned and open spaces expanded, movement across exposed terrain became unavoidable. Walking on two legs was not efficient at first. It was unstable, slow, and physically demanding, but it allowed survival under conditions where other options were disappearing. This distinction matters. Upright walking did not emerge as a perfected solution. It emerged as a response to loss. Moving bipedally freed the hands. But it also shifted the entire structure of the body in ways that introduced new vulnerabilities. The spine, originally shaped for horizontal movement, was forced into a vertical load-bearing role it was never designed for. Joints experienced stress patterns they had not evolved to handle. Balance became a constant challenge rather than a passive state. These costs did not appear later. They were present from the beginning. Early bipedalism was inefficient and risky. Falling carried higher consequences. Injuries were harder to recover from. Yet under environmental pressure, imperfect movement was better than no movement at all. Upright walking also altered how early humans interacted with their surroundings. Exposure to sunlight increased. Heat regulation became a persistent issue. The body had to manage temperature while moving long distances across open ground. This required changes in posture, stride, and eventually skin and sweat regulation. But none of these adaptations appeared instantly. For long periods, early human ancestors existed in bodies that were poorly matched to their new mode of movement. They survived not because upright walking was ideal, but because it was tolerable enough under specific conditions. This tolerance did not remove danger, it redistributed it. Predators were easier to spot at a distance, but escape was slower. Carrying objects became possible, but speed was reduced. Every benefit came paired with a cost that could not be fully eliminated. Importantly, upright walking did not replace earlier forms of movement overnight. Early humans likely alternated between walking upright and climbing when possible. This transitional phase further destabilized the body. Limbs were pulled between competing functions, hands adapted for manipulation while still retaining traits for locomotion. Feet lost grasping ability while gaining support roles. This created a body that was neither fully arboreal nor fully terrestrial for a long time. Evolution did not pause to refine this state. It allowed it to persist as long as it did not fail completely. This persistence shaped the future trajectory of human evolution. Once upright walking became common enough, other traits began to build around it. But those traits did not correct its flaws, they accommodated them. Muscle distribution shifted, pelvic structure changed, balance mechanisms adjusted. Each modification reduced some risks while introducing others. Over time, upright walking became less inefficient, but it never became perfect. Even in modern humans, its limitations remain obvious. Chronic back pain, joint degeneration, and balance-related injuries are not modern problems alone. They are inherited consequences of an evolutionary compromise that was never fully resolved. Understanding this reframes the meaning of bipedalism. It was not a step toward superiority. It was an acceptance of instability in exchange for access to new environments. Early human evolution did not choose the best option. It chose the least failing one available at the time. Upright walking survived not because it eliminated risk, but because it allowed continued movement through a world that no longer supported older ways of living. This pattern will repeat throughout the story of human evolution. Traits will emerge not as triumphs, but as temporary arrangements shaped by pressure, imbalance, and necessity. Upright walking is simply one of the earliest and most visible examples of this process. It marks the moment when the human body began carrying forward a structural tension that would never fully disappear. And as this tension deepened, it set the stage for further changes that would reshape not only how humans moved, but how they lived, interacted, and eventually thought. Once upright, walking became a regular part of survival. Its consequences began to unfold slowly and quietly, often far from the moment it first appeared. Bipedalism did not simply change how early humans moved. It reshaped the entire structure of life around the body. One of the most significant effects was on reproduction. Walking upright required a narrower pelvis to support balance and efficient movement. At the same time, brain size was beginning to increase, even if only modestly at first. These two trends were not coordinated. They collided. Birth became more difficult long before modern humans existed. The process of delivering offspring turned into a high-risk event, not because something went wrong, but because nothing was designed to make it easy. This tension between movement and reproduction never resolved. It intensified. Early human infants were born increasingly helpless, not as an advantage, but as a compromise. Survival now depended on prolonged care, protection, and social support. This created a new kind of fragility. The body could no longer complete its development before exposure to the world. Instead, development continued outside the womb, under constant risk. Upright walking also transformed patterns of injury and recovery. A vertical spine absorbs shock differently than a horizontal one. Falls became more dangerous. Joint wear increased. Minor misalignments could produce chronic pain. These were not rare side effects. They were structural consequences. Early humans lived with bodies that required constant compensation to remain functional. Muscles had to stabilize joints that were never meant to bear weight in this way. Energy was spent maintaining posture rather than movement alone. Fatigue became part of daily survival. Importantly, evolution did not correct these issues. It tolerated them. This tolerance explains why so many physical weaknesses remain embedded in the human body today. They are not oversights. They are accepted costs. Bipedalism also altered how humans interacted with danger. Standing upright improved visibility, but it reduced speed. It made ambush harder, but escape less reliable. Early humans could not outrun many predators. They could not outfight them either. Survival increasingly depended on anticipation, cooperation, and shared vigilance. This shifted pressure away from individual physical performance and toward group coordination. Again, behavior compensated where biology fell short. Upright walking created a body that required awareness rather than strength to survive. Over time, this reshaped daily life. Movement became deliberate. Terrain had to be read carefully. Energy had to be managed across longer distances. Mistakes carried lasting consequences. Injuries did not heal easily. A damaged joint or spine could mean the end of mobility, and therefore survival. This reality shaped social behavior long before complex culture emerged. Individuals who could not move independently had to be supported or abandoned. Groups that could afford support had a survival advantage. But this advantage came at a cost of increased dependence. The human body, once committed to upright walking, could no longer function well in isolation. It required social buffering to offset its weaknesses. This is a crucial point in understanding how human evolution actually happened. Bipedalism did not make humans independent explorers of open landscapes. It made them vulnerable walkers who survived by sharing risk. The body alone was no longer sufficient. This dependency did not represent moral progress. It represented necessity. Upright walking forced early humans into a state where survival required coordination, timing, and memory of past dangers. Over generations, these demands shaped selection pressures that favored not stronger bodies, but bodies that could endure imperfection long enough for behavior to compensate. The cost of this arrangement was constant tension. Pain became common. Recovery became slow. Stability was never guaranteed. Even today, these costs remain visible. The human skeleton still reflects compromises made under pressure millions of years ago. Back pain, joint degeneration, and balance-related injuries are not failures of modern life. They are inherited reminders of an evolutionary decision that was never revisited. Understanding this reframes upright walking once again. It was not the foundation of freedom. It was the beginning of dependence. It tied survival to cooperation, learning, and constant adjustment. And as these demands accumulated, they pushed human evolution toward deeper reliance on systems beyond the body itself. This growing gap between physical capability and survival requirement will continue to widen in the next stages of the story, shaping not only how humans moved, but how they began to think, remember, and relate to one another. By the time upright walking became firmly established, its flaws were already deeply embedded in the human body. What matters is not that these flaws existed, but that they were never fully corrected. Evolution did not return to redesign the spine, widen the pelvis without consequence, or eliminate the long-term stress placed on joints. Instead, it moved forward by building around these weaknesses. This reveals something essential about how human evolution actually happened. Once a trait became common enough to sustain reproduction, its problems became invisible to natural selection. Pain that appeared later in life, injuries that accumulated slowly, and instability that shortened mobility after reproductive age were not strong enough pressures to reverse the change. Survival only needed to last long enough. Everything beyond that was irrelevant to the process. Upright walking locked the human lineage into a structural path that could not easily be undone. Any attempt to fully return to earlier forms of movement would have required reversing too many interconnected traits at once. Evolution does not perform clean reversals. It tolerates imbalance and compensates locally. This is why the human body feels like a system constantly managing itself rather than a structure resting in equilibrium. Muscles compensate for joints. Behavior compensates for anatomy. Social support compensates for injury. These layers of compensation accumulated over time, allowing bipedalism to persist without ever becoming stable. Importantly, this persistence reshaped selection pressures moving forward. Once upright, walking defined the basic mode of movement. Traits that supported endurance, coordination, and sustained activity became more relevant than raw strength or speed. The human body shifted toward efficiency over distance, even if that efficiency remained imperfect. This change did not remove vulnerability. It redistributed it across time. Instead of acute failure, humans became prone to gradual breakdown. Instead of sudden death, they faced prolonged impairment. This pattern is visible in the fossil record and reflected in modern bodies. The consequences of bipedalism are not dramatic events, they are slow processes, where imbalance, fatigue, and pain unfold quietly, often accepted as normal, rather than recognized as inherited instability. From an evolutionary perspective, this quietness is precisely why these traits endured. They did not prevent reproduction. They did not cause immediate extinction. They simply required constant management. Upright walking also constrained future evolution. Once the body committed to vertical posture, other changes had to accommodate it. The shape of the chest, the position of the head, the alignment of sensory organs, and the distribution of weight all became tied to this posture. This reduced the range of possible adaptations available later. Evolution did not gain freedom through bipedalism, it lost options. The human lineage became increasingly specialized around a fragile form of movement that could not easily be replaced. This specialization created long-term dependence on behavior and environment to offset physical limits. Tools reduced strain, shelters reduced exposure, social structures reduced individual risk. These solutions did not emerge because humans were becoming smarter in a vacuum. They emerged because the body alone was no longer sufficient. Upright walking forced evolution to lean away from anatomy and toward external support systems. This shift would shape every stage that followed. It explains why later developments in human evolution emphasize coordination, learning, and shared knowledge, rather than radical physical redesign. The body had reached a point where further structural change carried too much risk. Instead, survival improved by changing how the body was used, not what it was made of. This is why bipedalism marks a turning point that is often misunderstood. It was not the moment humans became free to explore the world. It was the moment they became locked into a form that required constant adjustment to remain viable. From this point on, human evolution would increasingly operate through indirect means. Culture, cooperation, and cognition would compensate for physical compromise. The body would remain imperfect, but survival would continue by shifting pressure elsewhere. Understanding this allows us to see upright walking not as a foundation of strength, but as the origin of a long chain of dependencies. It set the pattern for how human evolution would proceed. Problems would not be solved. They would be managed. Instability would not be eliminated. It would be distributed. And the cost of this arrangement would accumulate quietly across generations, shaping the human experience long before anyone had the words to describe it. With bipedalism fully established, human evolution did not resolve its tension with the environment. It carried that tension forward, embedding it deeper into the body and the way life was lived. This unresolved state became the condition under which the next major transformations would unfold, not because the body was ready for them, but because it could no longer return to what it once was. The growth of the human brain is often described as the moment intelligence took control of evolution. It is portrayed as a decisive upgrade, the feature that separated humans from every other species. But when the brain first began to increase in size, it was not a symbol of mastery. It was a response to limitation. By the time this change started to matter, the human body was already locked into compromises that could not be reversed. Upright walking had introduced instability. Physical strength and speed were no longer reliable paths to survival. Environmental unpredictability continued to apply pressure faster than biological structures could adjust. Under these conditions, the brain did not grow because it promised a better future. It grew because existing solutions were failing. A larger brain did not replace physical weakness. It compensated for it. This distinction is critical. Intelligence did not appear as a goal. It appeared as an expense the body was forced to carry. Brain tissue is costly. It consumes enormous amounts of energy. It increases the demands placed on the body, especially during development. For early human ancestors, supporting a growing brain meant diverting resources away from other systems. Muscles, immune response, and physical resilience all paid part of the cost. This trade-off did not create a stronger organism. It created a more demanding one. Survival now required more calories, longer periods of care, and greater coordination within groups. The brain did not simplify life. It complicated it. Early increases in brain size did not produce abstract thought, language, or self-awareness as we understand them today. They supported immediate needs: memory of food locations, recognition of social relationships, anticipation of danger based on past experience. These functions were valuable because the environment had become too unstable to navigate through instinct alone. But they did not guarantee safety. They only reduced uncertainty slightly. Importantly, the brain did not evolve in isolation. Its growth intensified existing vulnerabilities. Larger brains extended childhood. Longer childhood increased dependence. Dependence increased risk. Infants became more helpless. Parents became more burdened. Survival increasingly depended on group stability rather than individual capacity. This was not a planned transition. It was a cascading effect of earlier compromises. Once the brain began to grow, it set off a chain of pressures that reinforced one another. Behavioral flexibility increased, but so did the consequences of failure. Mistakes became more costly. Learning took time. Errors carried social and physical penalties. The brain also introduced a new form of instability. Cognitive systems must constantly process information, assess threats, and anticipate outcomes. Early human ancestors did not experience this as modern anxiety, but the foundations were already present. A mind that can imagine future danger cannot fully rest. This persistent alertness may have improved survival in unpredictable environments, but it came at a physiological cost. Stress systems became more active. Recovery became less complete. Over generations, these pressures shaped a nervous system that was responsive rather than calm. Evolution tolerated this because the benefits outweighed the costs under specific conditions. But tolerance is not the same as optimization. The growing brain did not resolve the mismatch between body and environment. It managed it temporarily. It allowed early humans to survive with bodies that were increasingly strained by their own structure. This pattern mirrors what we saw with bipedalism. Instead of correcting a problem, evolution added a layer of complexity on top of it. The brain became another system that required constant support and maintenance. When conditions were favorable, this investment paid off. When they were not, it amplified vulnerability. Understanding this reframes the meaning of brain expansion in human evolution. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a reluctant shift toward a costly form of survival, a form that traded physical reliability for cognitive flexibility. This trade did not make early humans dominant. It made them dependent on conditions remaining just manageable enough for a highly demanding system to function. As brain size continued to increase, this dependency would deepen. shaping not only how humans survived, but how they experienced the world within their own minds. As brain size continued to increase, one of its most profound effects appeared not in adulthood, but at the very beginning of life. Larger brains required longer periods of development, yet the constraints imposed by upright walking limited how long gestation could safely last. This created a condition that would shape human evolution more deeply than intelligence itself. Human infants began to be born before they were ready. Compared to other species, they arrived unfinished. Their brains were large, but far from fully formed. Their bodies were weak, their coordination minimal, and their survival depended almost entirely on others. This was not an advantage. It was a risk that had to be managed continuously. Extended childhood was not selected because it encouraged learning or creativity. It emerged because there was no other option. The body could not support longer pregnancy, and the brain could not develop faster. Evolution accepted vulnerability and shifted the burden of development into the environment after birth. This change altered the rhythm of life. Early humans now had to invest time, energy, and attention into offspring for many years. Survival became a long-term project, rather than a brief reproductive event. This dependence reshaped social structure. Individuals could no longer survive alone, and children could not survive without stable groups. It became essential. Groups that could tolerate prolonged dependency were more likely to persist. Those that could not fractured under the strain. This pressure did not create kindness or morality. It created necessity. Care was required, because without it, offspring would not survive to reproduce. Over time, this necessity reinforced selection for social tolerance, coordination, and shared responsibility. But it also increased exposure to failure. When food was scarce, prolonged childhood magnified risk. When adults were injured or lost, dependent offspring faced immediate danger. The growing brain amplified both survival and vulnerability at once. It demanded a stable social environment in a world that remained unstable. This tension never resolved. It became a defining feature of human life. The long developmental window also meant that learning replaced instinct as the primary guide for behavior. Many actions that other species perform automatically had to be acquired slowly through observation and repetition. This increased flexibility, but it also increased error. Mistakes were no longer rare events. They became part of development. Early humans lived in a state where knowledge was fragile and easily lost. Skills had to be maintained across generations through teaching and imitation. This made groups interdependent across time, not just space. The survival of one generation became tied to the memory of the previous one. Brain growth, therefore, did not simply enhance problem solving. It tied survival to continuity. Breaks in social transmission became as dangerous as environmental shocks. This added another layer of instability to human evolution. Cognitive capacity increased, but it required constant reinforcement. Unlike physical traits, learned behaviors could disappear within a single generation if conditions disrupted social structure. The brain also altered how humans experienced time. With extended childhood came prolonged anticipation. Waiting became unavoidable. Rewards were delayed. Consequences stretched further into the future. This changed motivation and perception. Survival was no longer immediate. It became something to be managed over years. This shift placed new demands on emotional regulation and attention. Early humans had to endure uncertainty for longer periods without resolution. This endurance did not emerge because it was beneficial. It emerged because life demanded it. Over generations, nervous systems adapted to sustain prolonged alertness and learning. But these adaptations were costly. Energy expenditure increased. Stress responses became more active. Recovery became incomplete. These costs accumulated quietly, tolerated as long as reproduction continued. The expanding brain did not solve the problem of survival under pressure. Risk moved from the environment into the developmental process itself. Instead of dying quickly, humans risked failing slowly. Instead of immediate extinction, they faced prolonged dependence that could collapse under strain. This transformation explains why human evolution cannot be reduced to intelligence alone. The brain reshaped life by stretching vulnerability across time. It made survival more complex, more social, and more fragile. Understanding this reveals how deeply interconnected physical compromise and cognitive expansion truly were. The brain did not rise above the body. It grew within the limits imposed by it, and as those limits tightened, the cost of maintaining intelligence increased, shaping a species that survived not by becoming complete, but by remaining dependent, adaptable, and unfinished for longer than any of its ancestors. As the human brain continued to expand, it introduced a consequence that is often overlooked when intelligence is celebrated as an evolutionary achievement. A larger brain does not simply solve problems, it creates new ones. The same cognitive capacity that allows anticipation, planning, and learning also exposes the mind to uncertainty in ways the body was never prepared to manage. Early humans did not gain a sense of control through intelligence. They gained awareness of risk. A mind capable of remembering past dangers and imagining future threats cannot remain fully present. It must constantly scan, compare, and predict. This continuous mental activity did not bring calm. It brought vigilance. From an evolutionary perspective, this vigilance made sense. In unstable environments, anticipating danger could mean survival. But anticipation comes with a cost. The nervous system must remain active even in the absence of immediate threat. Recovery becomes incomplete. Rest becomes shallow. Over time, this creates a state where alertness replaces equilibrium. The human brain did not evolve to feel safe. It evolved to notice when safety might disappear. This shift reshaped emotional experience. Fear was no longer limited to direct encounters. It extended into memory and expectation. Early humans could carry stress forward even when danger had passed. This internalization of pressure marked a new stage in human evolution. Survival was no longer determined solely by physical exposure to the environment. It was shaped by how the environment was represented internally. The brain became both a tool for survival and a source of ongoing strain. Importantly, evolution did not correct this strain. As long as heightened awareness improved survival odds in the short term, its long-term effects were tolerated. Anxiety, restlessness, and difficulty disengaging from threat were not selected against because they did not prevent reproduction. They were costs paid quietly, often later in life. This explains why mental tension feels deeply human rather than pathological. It is not a malfunction layered onto modern life. It is an inherited feature of a brain shaped under persistent uncertainty. The expanding brain also intensified dependence on meaning and pattern. Faced with incomplete information and unpredictable outcomes, early humans began to search for coherence. Understanding cause and effect, recognizing regularities, and forming expectations became essential. But the world rarely offered clear answers. This mismatch between cognitive demand and environmental ambiguity produced a constant sense of unresolved tension. Questions could be asked faster than they could be answered. Intelligence did not resolve uncertainty. It multiplied it. The more the brain could imagine alternatives, the harder it became to settle into any single outcome. This internal complexity had social consequences as well. Shared understanding became necessary to coordinate action, but consensus was fragile. Misinterpretation could lead to conflict. Communication reduced risk, but introduced misunderstanding. Again, the brain extended survival while adding instability. This pattern mirrors everything we have seen so far. Evolution did not replace one problem with a solution. It replaced it with a more complex arrangement of pressures. The brain did not free humans from their environment. It tied them to it more deeply, through memory, anticipation, and emotional response. Over generations, this produced a species capable of extraordinary adaptation, but prone to internal imbalance. The nervous system became finely tuned to change, but poorly suited for stillness. Calm became conditional rather than default. Even in moments of safety, the mind remained ready to respond. This readiness was useful when danger was frequent. It became burdensome when conditions stabilized, even briefly, yet evolution did not remove it. Stability was never guaranteed long enough to reward calm. Understanding this helps explain why the growth of intelligence did not bring closure to human evolution. It did not create a stable endpoint. It extended the process inward. Pressure that once acted primarily on the body now acted on perception, emotion, and thought. Human evolution moved from visible compromise to invisible tension. The body carried its flaws openly, the mind carried its burdens quietly. This transition did not mark the completion of the evolutionary journey. It marked its deepening. From this point forward, survival would depend not only on how humans moved and cooperated, but on how they managed an internal world shaped by constant anticipation. The brain did not lift humans above their evolutionary past. It absorbed it, and in doing so, it ensured that the story of human evolution would continue to unfold not just in bones and tools, but within the restless space of the human mind itself. For a long time, human evolution has been imagined as a lonely journey, as if our species moved forward while everything else faded into the background. But this picture is deeply misleading. There was a long period in evolutionary history when being human did not mean being one thing. It meant being many things at the same time. Multiple human species lived side by side, often sharing the same landscapes, facing the same climates, and competing for the same resources. Homo sapiens were not alone, and they were not obviously superior. They were one variation among many, shaped by similar pressures, but responding in different ways. This period reveals something essential about how human evolution actually happened. It was not a single path unfolding smoothly. It was a crowded field of experiments running simultaneously. Each human species represented a different solution to the same fundamental problem: how to survive in an unstable world with bodies already burdened by compromise. Some were more robust, some were more energy efficient, some were better adapted to cold, others to open terrain. None of them knew which traits would matter next. Evolution did not guide these lineages toward a common destination. It allowed them to exist as long as they remained compatible with their surroundings. During this time, there was no clear hierarchy. The presence of multiple human species does not imply a ladder of progress. It implies overlap. These species did not appear in neat succession. They overlapped in time, space, and behavior. They interacted, sometimes indirectly, sometimes face-to-face. Their tools often looked similar. Their diets overlapped. Their social lives likely followed comparable patterns shaped by dependence and cooperation. From the perspective of the environment, there was no reason to favor one over the others in advance. Survival depended on how well each group matched a shifting set of conditions, not on how closely they resembled modern humans. This challenges the comforting idea that Homo sapiens were always destined to prevail. During much of this period, there was nothing inevitable about our survival. Other human species were not failed attempts leading up to us. They were complete evolutionary outcomes in their own right. They persisted for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, adapting, reproducing, and maintaining their own ways of life. Their eventual disappearance does not imply inferiority. It reflects the narrow margins under which all human species existed. When environments changed, when resources shifted, or when competition intensified, some lineages fell out of alignment. Evolution did not replace them with better versions. It simply continued with fewer options. Importantly, the coexistence of multiple human species reveals how unpredictable evolutionary outcomes truly are. At various points, small differences could have tipped survival in another direction. A population isolated by geography, a group protected by favorable climate cycles, a lineage benefiting from a temporary abundance of resources. These contingencies mattered more than any inherent advantage. Human evolution was shaped by circumstance layered upon compromise. The crowded nature of this period also amplified pressure. When several human species occupied similar niches, competition became unavoidable. Resources were finite. Territories overlapped. Adaptations that worked in isolation could become liabilities in shared environments. This competition did not reward intelligence or innovation alone. It rewarded timing, location, and resilience under stress. Survival became even more precarious. Being human meant sharing a fragile existence with other humans who were, in many ways, just as capable of survival. This phase of evolution forces us to reconsider what it meant to be human before Homo sapiens became the only remaining lineage. Humanity was not a singular identity. It was a category containing diversity, variation, and unresolved tension. They were distributed across different forms, each shaped by the same underlying pressures, but arranged differently in body and behavior. Understanding this period dissolves the illusion of a straight line leading toward us. It reveals a branching, crowded process where survival was never guaranteed and success was always temporary. Homo sapiens emerged from this complexity not because they were the intended outcome, but because they remained aligned with conditions that others could not sustain indefinitely. This alignment would not last forever either. It would only last long enough to carry the process forward. And to understand why our lineage endured while others faded, we must first accept that for much of human history, being human meant being plural, unstable, and replaceable within an evolutionary system that never chose favorites. When multiple human species shared the same world, their coexistence was not peaceful or orderly. It was shaped by proximity, pressure, and uncertainty. These groups did not evolve in isolation, separated neatly by time or geography. They crossed paths, they moved through overlapping territories, they followed similar animals, relied on similar plants, and sought shelter in the same kinds of landscapes. This closeness created a dynamic that deeply influenced how human evolution unfolded. Survival was no longer determined solely by environment. It was shaped by the presence of other humans who were trying to survive in similar ways. Competition did not always take the form of direct conflict. More often, it emerged quietly through resource overlap. When one group expanded into an area, it reduced availability for others. When climate conditions worsened, pressure intensified. A lineage that might have survived alone could be pushed out simply because another lineage occupied the same space at the wrong time. Evolution did not intervene to balance these outcomes. It allowed them to play out unevenly. This meant that extinction was often the result of cumulative disadvantage rather than sudden failure. Small losses repeated over generations could erase an entire human species without a single defining event. Interaction between human species also created opportunities for exchange. Evidence suggests that some groups shared tools, techniques, and possibly knowledge. Cultural traits did not belong exclusively to one lineage. They moved across boundaries. This complicates the idea that innovation alone ensured survival. A useful behavior could spread, but it did not guarantee long-term alignment with environmental change. Shared solutions did not eliminate competition. They intensified it by reducing differentiation. When groups became more similar in how they lived, they competed more directly for the same resources. This increased vulnerability. In such conditions, even minor advantages in timing or location could determine which lineage persisted. Importantly, coexistence also meant exposure to the failures of others. A disease, a disrupted migration pattern, or a collapsed food source affecting one group could ripple outward. Shared environments linked fates together. The success of one population could destabilize another. Evolution did not isolate outcomes, it entangled them. This entanglement reveals why survival cannot be explained through superiority alone. No human species controlled the conditions shaping its future. They responded locally, often without awareness of broader patterns. Decisions that improved survival in one generation could reduce flexibility in the next. Expansion into a favorable region could create dependence on conditions that would later disappear. Coexistence magnified these risks. The presence of other human species reduced margins for error. There was less space to retreat, fewer alternatives when conditions shifted. This pressure favored lineages that could absorb disruption without collapsing immediately. But resilience does not require perfection. It requires tolerance, tolerance for loss, tolerance for inefficiency, tolerance for instability. Some human species may have been better adapted to specific environments, but this specialization became dangerous when climates oscillated. Others remained more generalized, less efficient but more flexible. In a crowded evolutionary landscape, flexibility mattered, not because it was optimal, but because it allowed persistence through uncertainty. Interaction also blurred boundaries between lineages. Genetic evidence shows that human species did not remain entirely separate. They interbred. They exchanged traits. This challenges the idea of clean evolutionary divisions. Humanity did not evolve through isolation, but through contact. Survival did not depend on purity. It depended on compatibility. Traits that crossed between groups could strengthen one lineage while weakening another. Again, evolution did not plan these outcomes. It tolerated them. Over time, the crowded field of human species thinned. Some disappeared quickly. Others faded gradually. Their loss did not signal progress. It signaled misalignment. Conditions shifted. Pressures accumulated. Lineages that could not adjust fast enough fell behind. Those that remained did not represent the best possible humans. They represented the ones still standing. Understanding this period reveals how deeply contingent human evolution truly was. The presence of other human species shaped our lineage not by guiding it forward, but by narrowing its options. Survival became a matter of endurance within a shrinking space of possibility. Homo sapiens did not emerge victorious because they overcame all others. They remained because they adapted to the consequences of coexistence longer than the rest. This endurance was temporary, not triumphant. It carried forward the same instability that defined earlier stages. And as the number of human species declined, the pressure did not disappear. With fewer alternatives left, the burden of survival rested increasingly on a single lineage. What remained was not a conclusion, but a narrowing path that would shape everything that followed. By the time only one human species remained, the disappearance of the others had already reshaped the evolutionary landscape. This moment is often described as a conclusion, as if the process had selected a final and superior form. But the reality was far less decisive. The thinning of human diversity did not resolve instability, it concentrated it. When multiple human species existed, pressure was distributed across several lineages. When they vanished, that pressure did not disappear. It settled onto the one lineage that remained. Homo sapiens did not inherit a stable world. They inherited a world that had already eliminated alternatives. This distinction matters because it changes how we understand survival. Being the last remaining human species did not mean conditions had become favorable. It meant conditions had become narrow. The range of viable responses to environmental change shrank as diversity disappeared. Flexibility did not increase. It became more precious. The loss of other human species also meant the loss of alternative ways of being human. Different body plans, metabolic strategies, and social arrangements vanished with them. These were not backups waiting to be replaced. They were options that no longer existed. Evolution did not preserve them for future use. Once gone, they were gone permanently. This is why the end of the multi-species period did not mark progress. It marked constraint. Homo sapiens now carried forward a single configuration shaped by compromises that could not easily be revised. Any future challenge would have to be met with variations within that narrow framework. There would be no return to earlier forms, no switching to alternative solutions that had already failed elsewhere. Survival would depend on managing limitation rather than escaping it. This concentration of pressure also altered how extinction functioned. When several human species existed, extinction was distributed. Some disappeared while others persisted. Once only one remained, extinction became absolute. There would be no replacement lineage ready to continue the process. The stakes changed. Survival became all or nothing. This did not make Homo sapiens more resilient. It made them more exposed. The evolutionary system no longer had redundancy. every vulnerability mattered more. This exposure shaped behavior in subtle ways. Risk avoidance became critical. Long-term planning gained importance, not because it guaranteed success, but because failure now carried final consequences. At the same time, the absence of other human species removed a form of competition that had previously shaped adaptation. Without close relatives occupying similar niches, Homo sapiens expanded into a wider range of environments. This expansion is often interpreted as dominance. But expansion can also be a sign of necessity. With fewer alternatives left, the remaining lineage had to stretch itself across varied conditions, even when it was poorly suited for them. This increased dependence on behavioral flexibility, cultural transmission, and cooperation. The body alone could not manage the demands of diverse environments. Tools, shelters, shared knowledge, and social organization became increasingly central to survival. Pressure moved away from immediate physical competition and toward long-term coordination under uncertainty. The disappearance of other human species also changed how identity formed. There was no longer a visible comparison between different kinds of humans. The remaining lineage could now imagine itself as the default, even the endpoint. But this perception was a byproduct of absence, not evidence of destiny. Homo sapiens did not replace others because they were meant to. They remained because they endured a particular sequence of pressures slightly longer. The traits that supported this endurance were not universally advantageous. They were context-dependent and fragile. When conditions shifted again, these same traits would generate new forms of vulnerability. It was the narrowing of possibility to a single thread. From this point on, every adaptation, every cultural development, and every expansion would occur within the constraints of a lineage shaped by loss. Human evolution did not simplify when diversity disappeared. It became more precarious. The margin for error shrank. The cost of failure increased. What remained was not a perfected human, but a survivor carrying forward unresolved tensions accumulated across millions of years. These tensions did not vanish with the disappearance of other human species. They intensified. They would shape how Homo sapiens interacted with the environment, with each other, and eventually with themselves. The end of the multi-species era did not close the story of human evolution. It tightened it. It set the conditions under which every future change would have to operate. Not in a world full of alternatives, but in a world where being human had become singular, exposed, and dependent on managing the consequences of everything that had already been lost. As human evolution continued along a narrowing path, many traits that once supported survival began to reveal a different side. These traits did not suddenly become mistakes. They became mismatches. What had worked under one set of pressures started to create problems under another. This is what evolutionary dead ends look like from the inside. They are not dramatic failures. They are slow accumulations of cost. Early human ancestors survived by adapting to instability, scarcity, and threat. Traits that favored quick response, heightened alertness, and energy conservation were valuable when danger was constant and resources unpredictable. But evolution does not know when conditions are about to change. It preserves what works now, even if that same trait will become a liability later. One of the clearest examples is energy storage. In environments where food availability fluctuated, bodies that could store excess calories had a survival advantage. Fat was insurance. It allowed endurance through famine and illness. Over generations, human metabolism adapted to prioritize storage when food was available. But it also locked the body into a pattern that assumed scarcity. When environments shifted and food became more consistently available, this same trait produced imbalance. Energy storage continued, but the conditions that once justified it faded. The result was not adaptation, it was inertia. Evolution did not remove the trait because it had not yet prevented reproduction. Another dead end emerged in stress response systems. Early humans lived in environments where rapid reaction could mean the difference between life and death. Nervous systems that responded quickly to threat were favored. Hormonal cascades that mobilized energy sharpened attention, and suppressed non-essential functions improved immediate survival. These systems were never designed to turn off completely. They were designed to keep organisms alive long enough to reproduce. When threats became less immediate but more chronic, the same systems remained active. The body continued to prepare for danger even when danger was distant or abstract. This produced wear rather than protection. Again, evolution tolerated this because the cost appeared gradually. Pain, fatigue, and breakdown often emerged after reproductive age. From an evolutionary perspective, these outcomes were invisible. The same pattern appears in social behavior. Cooperation and group dependence increased survival under pressure. Sharing resources, defending territory together, and caring for vulnerable members improved group resilience. But this dependence also reduced individual autonomy. Survival became tied to social stability. When groups fractured, individuals became highly vulnerable. This fragility was not resolved, it was accepted. Human evolution did not move toward independence. It moved toward interdependence that could collapse under strain. These dead ends were not accidents layered onto human evolution. They were direct consequences of earlier solutions. Traits that solved immediate problems created long-term constraints. The human body and mind became systems optimized for short-term survival in unstable environments, not for long-term equilibrium. When conditions stabilized even slightly, these systems did not recalibrate. They continued to operate as if danger and scarcity were imminent. This mismatch is not a modern phenomenon. It began deep in evolutionary time. Understanding this challenges the idea that evolution produces optimal outcomes. It produces survivable ones. Dead ends are not mistakes. They are paths that remain viable only under specific conditions. When those conditions disappear, the path does not close cleanly. It persists, generating cost. This persistence explains why many human traits feel out of place in calmer environments. They are not designed for calm. They are designed for endurance under threat. Evolution did not foresee peace, abundance, or stability. As pressures changed, the preserved traits remained, carrying their original assumptions forward. This is how dead ends form, not through failure, but through success that lasts too long. Early humans carried forward adaptations that kept them alive, but those same adaptations narrowed future possibilities. Once embedded, they constrained what could change next. Evolution did not reset the system. It layered new adjustments on top of old ones. This layering increased complexity without removing tension. By the time Homo sapiens became the only remaining human species, the body and mind were already carrying a legacy of unresolved compromises. These compromises did not halt evolution. They shaped its direction. They ensured that future changes would not erase past costs, but accumulate them. Understanding this is essential to grasping how human evolution actually happened. It was not a sequence of improvements leading toward balance. It was a series of solutions that became burdens as conditions shifted. The dead ends were not avoided. They were inherited, and as human evolution continued, it would increasingly have to work around these inherited constraints rather than escape them. As these evolutionary dead ends accumulated, they did not remain abstract patterns. They became lived experiences embedded in the human body and mind. Many of the limitations humans carry today are not recent problems created by modern life. They are the direct continuation of adaptations that once made survival possible under very different conditions. One such dead end is the way the human body manages pain and repair. Early humans benefited from pain responses that were immediate and intense. Pain signaled danger, forced withdrawal, and prevented further injury. But these systems were designed for acute threats, not for prolonged strain. As upright walking, repetitive movement, and long-distance travel became common, the body was subjected to constant low-level stress. Joints wore down gradually, muscles compensated unevenly. Pain signals that once protected survival became persistent rather than informative. Evolution did not refine these systems to distinguish between short-term danger and long-term damage. As long as individuals could function well enough to reproduce, chronic pain remained an acceptable cost. This pattern extended to immune response. In unpredictable environments filled with parasites, wounds, and infection, immune systems that reacted aggressively were favored. Rapid inflammation increased survival odds, but aggressive defense carries risk. It damages tissue. It consumes energy. When threats became less immediate or shifted in nature, these same responses continued to activate. The result was not improved health, but wear. The immune system remained tuned for a world of constant injury. Evolution did not recalibrate it for longevity. Again, the cost appeared gradually, often after reproductive age. From the perspective of natural selection, this cost did not exist. Another dead end formed around energy use. The human brain demanded constant fuel. To support it, the body evolved mechanisms to prioritize glucose and fat storage. These mechanisms assumed irregular access to food and frequent scarcity. When environments offered more consistent nutrition, the systems did not adapt quickly. Storage continued. Regulation lagged. What once buffered survival began to distort metabolism. Evolution tolerated this imbalance because it did not immediately threaten reproduction. The mismatch widened slowly, carried forward generation by generation. Cognitive systems followed a similar pattern. Early humans relied on pattern recognition and rapid inference to survive uncertain environments. Seeing connections, even false ones, could be safer than missing a real threat. This bias toward meaning and agency improved vigilance, but it also increased susceptibility to error. The mind became prone to overinterpretation, assumption, and fixation. Evolution did not correct this tendency because it reduced immediate risk under pressure. Long-term consequences, such as persistent fear or rigid belief, were not filtered out. These traits remained because they worked well enough when danger was common and time to reflect was limited. Social dead ends formed as well. Strong group identity increased cohesion and protection. Loyalty improved survival in small, interdependent populations, but this same loyalty reduced tolerance for difference. Boundaries hardened. Outsiders became threats. Evolution favored cohesion, without evaluating its broader consequences. As groups expanded and environments grew more complex, these tendencies produced conflict rather than security. Yet they persisted because they had once protected survival at a smaller scale. None of these dead ends appeared suddenly. They emerged slowly as side effects of solutions that worked under pressure. Evolution did not notice when the context changed. It preserved the machinery and allowed new problems to accumulate around it. This explains why so many human systems feel overstressed rather than broken. They are doing exactly what they evolved to do, but in conditions they were never meant to handle for long. The human body and mind became layered with responses tuned for urgency, not stability. Calm was never the default state. It was an absence of immediate threat, not a condition to be maintained. Understanding these dead ends shifts how we interpret human suffering and limitation. They are not evidence that evolution failed. They are evidence that it succeeded within narrow margins and then stopped adjusting. Evolution does not optimize for comfort, clarity, or long-term balance. It optimizes for continuation. When continuation is achieved, even imperfectly, the process moves on, the cost is carried forward. These accumulated dead ends did not end human evolution. They shaped the space within which future adaptations would have to operate. Every new development would have to work around systems already strained by past compromises. This layering of unresolved costs explains why progress in one area often creates instability in another. Human evolution did not clear obstacles as it advanced. It piled them up, and as these piles grew higher, survival increasingly depended on managing complexity rather than resolving it. The next stages of the story will show how humans responded to this growing burden, not by redesigning their bodies, but by extending themselves outward into tools, symbols, and shared systems that could carry some of the weight their biology no longer could. What makes these evolutionary dead ends so persistent is not that they are hidden, but that they are irreversible in any simple way. Evolution cannot pause, look backward, and decide to correct what no longer fits. It cannot remove a deeply embedded trait without unraveling the structures built around it. Once a solution becomes foundational, even if flawed, it constrains everything that follows. This is why human evolution could not simply abandon its accumulated compromises. Too many systems depended on them. The body, the brain, and social behavior became tightly interwoven around traits that were never designed for long-term stability. Any attempt to reverse one element would destabilize the others. Upright walking, energy-hungry brains, prolonged childhood, and heightened stress response did not exist independently. They formed a connected system. Removing one would collapse the balance that allowed survival, however imperfectly. Evolution does not risk collapse for the sake of refinement. It preserves what holds together, even if it strains under its own weight. This explains why evolutionary dead ends are not corrected but endured. They are not seen by natural selection as errors. They are seen as acceptable costs within a functioning system. The threshold for removal is not discomfort or suffering. It is failure to reproduce. As long as reproduction continues, the structure remains. Pain that accumulates slowly, mental strain that intensifies with age, and social tension that flares under stress all fall below that threshold. They become part of the inherited condition. Over time, this produces a species that survives by managing limitation rather than eliminating it. Humans did not evolve toward ease. They evolved toward continuity under pressure. This continuity required constant compensation. When the body strained, behavior adjusted. When behavior strained, social systems expanded. When social systems strained, symbolic meaning and shared narratives emerged to maintain cohesion. Each layer absorbed pressure without removing its source. This pattern defines how human evolution moved forward through dead ends. It did not clear obstacles. It built scaffolding around them. The result was increasing complexity rather than resolution. Complexity can support survival, but it also increases fragility. Systems with many interdependent parts fail in subtle ways. Small disruptions can cascade. This is why human life feels simultaneously resilient and vulnerable. We can adapt to many conditions, but we are easily overwhelmed. Our strength lies in flexibility, not robustness. Flexibility allows survival across varied environments, but it requires constant adjustment. There is no resting state. Evolution locked humans into this mode early and never released them. The inability to reverse dead ends also shaped how humans related to time. Instead of seeking permanent solutions, human behavior began to favor temporary fixes. Short-term gains were prioritized because long-term stability was unattainable. This orientation toward immediacy is not a cultural flaw. It is an evolutionary inheritance. When environments change faster than biology can adapt, waiting for perfect solutions is fatal. Acting with incomplete information becomes necessary. This tendency carried forward into later stages of human development, influencing decision-making, risk-taking, and social organization. It also reinforced the accumulation of dead ends. Short-term survival strategies often deepen long-term constraints. Evolution tolerates this because it measures success narrowly. Each generation only needs to persist into the next. What happens beyond that horizon does not register. This narrow measurement explains why human evolution feels unfinished. It is unfinished because it never aimed to finish. It moved forward through necessity, not design. The dead ends were not obstacles to be avoided. They were pathways that happened to remain open longer than others. Understanding this reframes the human condition. Many struggles are not signs that something went wrong recently. They are signals that nothing ever went right in the way we imagine progress should work. The human lineage survived by carrying unresolved tension forward, embedding it deeper with each layer of adaptation. Evolution did not promise harmony between body, mind, and environment. It promised only continuation. The cost of that promise is a life lived within constraints that cannot be fully reconciled. This does not mean human evolution reached a mistake. It means it reached a point where retreat was impossible and refinement was too risky. From there, survival depended on expansion beyond biology. Tools, shared knowledge, and external systems would increasingly take on roles the body and mind could no longer fulfill alone. These developments did not erase the dead ends. They redistributed their impact. The next stages of human evolution will show how this redistribution reshaped daily life, turning inherited limitations into the driving force behind culture, cooperation, and symbolic meaning. Human evolution did not escape its dead ends. It learned to live inside them. When people look back at human evolution, it is tempting to search for a decisive advantage, something clear and measurable that explains why our lineage endured while so many others disappeared. Intelligence is often named, cooperation is praised, tool use is highlighted, but these explanations overlook a quieter force that shaped survival just as strongly. Much of human evolution unfolded not because our ancestors were better, but because they arrived at certain moments when conditions briefly aligned in their favor. These moments were narrow, they were unstable, and they were largely beyond control. Evolution does not reward the strongest or the smartest consistently. It rewards those who happen to fit a changing world at the right time. Early human ancestors did not face a single challenge that could be overcome once and for all. They faced sequences of disruption. Climate shifts, migrations of prey, emergence of new predators, and sudden scarcity created windows where certain traits mattered more than others. A trait that was neutral for thousands of years could become decisive during a brief environmental swing, then fade in relevance again. Survival often depended on being present during that swing, rather than possessing a timeless advantage. This is why many evolutionary outcomes appear accidental when viewed closely. Small populations that happened to occupy a favorable region during a harsh climate phase could persist, while larger, well-adapted populations elsewhere vanished. Geography mattered. Seasonality mattered. Even slight delays in movement could determine extinction or survival. These factors do not reflect superiority. They reflect coincidence layered onto resilience. Human evolution is full of these moments. Populations that crossed into new environments at the right time encountered fewer competitors. Groups that migrated just ahead of climate deterioration avoided collapse. Others, equally capable, arrived too late. Evolution did not compensate for bad timing. It allowed consequences to unfold unevenly. This unevenness shaped which lineages continued and which ended. Importantly, luck did not act alone. It interacted with existing traits in unpredictable ways. Flexibility increased the range of situations where luck could be favorable, but it did not guarantee success. A flexible group still needed opportunity. Intelligence increased the ability to exploit chance, but it did not create chance itself. Many human species possess similar capacities. What separated outcomes was often context rather than capability. This is why narratives that emphasize dominance miss the deeper pattern. Survival was not a reward earned through excellence. It was a condition extended through alignment. The environment briefly aligned with a particular set of traits, and those traits persisted. When alignment broke, extinction followed. Homo sapiens did not avoid this pattern. They benefited from it. Their lineage expanded during periods when climate variability favored generalists over specialists. Their spread coincided with moments when other human species were already under strain. These coincidences mattered more than any single innovation. Understanding this reframes how we interpret evolutionary success. Success suggests agency and achievement. Timing suggests exposure and vulnerability. Being in the right place at the right moment also means being in the wrong place at the wrong moment later. The same forces that allow expansion can later impose collapse. Evolution does not protect winners. It exposes them to new pressures. Early humans lived within this uncertainty. They did not know which traits would matter next. They did not prepare for distant futures. They responded to immediate circumstances with whatever tools and behaviors were available. When those responses aligned with shifting conditions, survival followed. This pattern repeated across millennia. The fossil record reflects it in uneven bursts of presence and absence, rather than smooth continuity. This reliance on timing explains why human evolution feels precarious even after survival is achieved. Persistence does not erase vulnerability, it carries it forward. Each survival event narrows the margin for error. Luck cannot be relied upon repeatedly. Yet evolution offers no alternative. There is no strategy that guarantees alignment across all future conditions. Understanding this helps explain why human evolution did not produce stability once Homo sapiens became dominant. Dominance itself was temporary, contingent, and dependent on continued alignment with forces beyond control. Survival through timing does not create security, it creates momentum. That momentum can carry a lineage forward rapidly, but it also increases exposure. As humans expanded into new environments, they did so under the assumption that alignment would continue. But evolution offers no such assurance. Timing works once, then shifts. This is the quiet tension at the heart of human evolution. Much of what endured did so, not because it was destined, but because it happened to arrive when the world briefly allowed it. And as we move forward in this story, we will see how reliance on timing and chance shaped not only survival, but the way humans came to understand risk, uncertainty, and control in a world that never offered guarantees. To see how deeply timing shaped human evolution, it helps to look at moments where small differences in circumstance produced vastly different outcomes. These moments rarely announce themselves as turning points. They unfold quietly, through shifts that seem minor in isolation but become decisive when layered over time. One such factor was climate oscillation. During periods when temperatures swung rapidly between warmer and colder phases, environments fragmented. Forests retreated, grasslands expanded, then contracted again. Human populations that happened to occupy transitional zones during these shifts often survived longer than those adapted to a single stable niche. This survival did not reflect superior design. It reflected exposure to variability at the right moment. Groups accustomed to fluctuation were less disrupted when conditions changed again. Others, equally capable, faced collapse because their environments changed too abruptly. Timing determined which adaptations remained useful and which became liabilities overnight. Human groups did not spread evenly across landscapes. They moved in pulses, following animals, water sources, and seasonal patterns. A group that migrated early into a new region could establish itself before conditions worsened elsewhere. A group that delayed might encounter depleted resources or intensified competition. These outcomes did not depend on intelligence alone. They depended on when movement occurred relative to environmental cycles. Even small delays could trap populations in shrinking habitats. The fossil record preserves traces of this uneven movement. Sudden appearances in one region coincide with disappearances in another. Evolution did not coordinate these shifts. It allowed them to unfold independently, rewarding those who happened to move at the right time. Disease and demographic pressure also interacted with timing. In small populations, a brief reduction in numbers could have irreversible consequences. A harsh season, a disrupted food source, or the loss of key individuals could push a group below the threshold needed to recover. Other populations, slightly larger or more dispersed, survived the same conditions. This difference did not reflect fitness in a broad sense. It reflected resilience at a specific moment. Once a population collapsed, evolution did not restore it. The absence became permanent. Timing also influenced interaction between human species. When different lineages overlapped, outcomes depended on who encountered whom, under which conditions. A population already weakened by environmental stress could be displaced by another that was not inherently stronger, only less burdened at that moment. These encounters did not produce clear winners. They produced survivors. The context mattered more than the traits themselves. Even technological developments followed this pattern. A new tool or technique did not guarantee survival. It mattered when and where it was adopted. A behavior introduced during abundance might spread slowly and have little impact. The same behavior adopted during scarcity could become essential. Timing transformed usefulness. Evolution did not evaluate innovations universally. It tested them against immediate conditions. Those that aligned persisted. Those that did not vanished, regardless of their potential value under different circumstances. This explains why similar capacities appear and disappear across human lineages. Intelligence, tool use, and social cooperation emerged multiple times. They did not ensure continuity. They needed alignment with the moment. The cumulative effect of these timing-dependent outcomes is a history that looks irregular rather than progressive. Long periods of stability are punctuated by sudden shifts. Expansion is followed by contraction. Presence gives way to absence. This pattern is not a flaw in the record. It is a reflection of how evolution operates when chance and pressure intersect. Survival often hinged on being exposed to the right challenges at the right intensity. Too little pressure produced stagnation. Too much produced collapse. Only a narrow range allowed persistence. Homo sapiens passed through this range repeatedly, not by controlling it, but by encountering it. Each passage narrowed future options. Populations that survived carried forward traits shaped by those specific moments. When conditions changed again, these traits could either help briefly or hinder disastrously. Evolution did not smooth these transitions. It amplified their consequences. Understanding these examples clarifies why human evolution cannot be reduced to a story of gradual improvement. It was a series of narrow escapes, shaped by coincidence as much as capability. Timing did not replace adaptation. It determined when adaptation mattered. This dependence on timing also explains why success in one era did not protect against failure in the next. Traits that aligned once could misalign later. Survival was always provisional. As we move forward, this reliance on momentary alignment will become even more pronounced. With fewer human species remaining and greater environmental reach, the cost of mistimed responses will increase. The same sensitivity to timing that once allowed persistence will begin to shape vulnerability in new ways. Surviving through timing and chance does not create security. It creates exposure. This is the final and often misunderstood consequence of luck in human evolution. When a lineage survives because conditions briefly align, it carries forward traits shaped by that alignment. Those traits are not tested against all possible futures. They are tested against one narrow set of circumstances that happen to occur. Survival, in this sense, does not strengthen a species against uncertainty. In human evolution, each successful passage through environmental disruption reduced diversity and increased dependence on specific strategies. What worked once became embedded. What failed disappeared. Over time, this narrowed the range of possible responses available when conditions shifted again. Luck did not widen opportunity. It concentrated it. This concentration explains why success often preceded vulnerability. Populations that expanded rapidly after surviving a favorable phase became more exposed to future change. Expansion spread bodies, behaviors, and expectations across environments that did not share the same stability. The traits that supported growth under one alignment were carried into contexts where they no longer fit. Evolution did not pause to recalibrate. It allowed the mismatch to unfold. This is why periods of apparent success in human evolution are often followed by stress, reorganization, or collapse. Survival through timing creates momentum, but momentum increases risk. Once moving, stopping or changing direction becomes difficult. This dynamic also shaped how humans related to uncertainty. When survival depended on catching the right moment, attention shifted toward anticipating change. Humans became increasingly sensitive to signs of instability. Small variations in climate, resource availability, or social conditions took on exaggerated importance. This sensitivity did not guarantee accurate prediction. It increased vigilance. Vigilance can extend survival briefly, but it also deepens stress. A species that survives by reacting quickly cannot afford prolonged calm. Calm feels unsafe because it offers no information. This psychological inheritance traces back to evolutionary reliance on timing. When missing a moment could mean extinction, waiting became dangerous. Acting with incomplete information became necessary. Over generations, this pattern reinforced a preference for movement, exploration, and expansion, even when conditions were uncertain. This tendency brought short-term gains and long-term strain. The reliance on luck also altered the meaning of failure. When survival feels contingent rather than earned, loss becomes harder to interpret. There is no clear mistake to correct. Entire populations could disappear without having done anything wrong. This unpredictability shaped social behavior. Groups sought stability where they could find it, often in shared narratives, traditions, and rituals that created a sense of continuity in an unreliable world. These practices did not change environmental conditions. They changed perception. They reduced uncertainty internally when it could not be reduced externally. Again, evolution did not select for truth or accuracy. It selected for persistence. Beliefs that supported cohesion and reduced hesitation could improve survival, even if they distorted reality. This is another way luck shaped the human mind. When outcomes depend on timing beyond control, meaning becomes a tool rather than a conclusion. The end of this reliance on luck never arrived. Even as Homo sapiens became the only remaining human species, survival continued to depend on alignment with forces that could not be predicted or controlled. Climate cycles persisted, resource distribution remained uneven, new challenges emerged unpredictably. The difference was scale. With fewer alternatives left, misalignment now threatened the entire species rather than individual lineages. This raised the stakes without increasing security. The same evolutionary pattern continued under greater pressure. Understanding this resolves a central confusion about human evolution. Survival does not imply robustness. It implies exposure that has not yet reached its breaking point. Each successful escape from extinction tightens constraints on the future. Luck buys time, not immunity. The longer a lineage persists through chance alignment, the more it accumulates assumptions about the world that may no longer hold. Human evolution carried these assumptions forward into every new environment. Some held briefly, others failed, none were guaranteed. This is why the story of human evolution cannot be told as a steady ascent toward safety. It is a sequence of narrow survivals that increase complexity and risk, rather than resolve them. Luck did not lift humans above evolutionary pressure. It pulled them deeper into it. As we move into the next stage of this story, we will see how the loss of alternatives and the weight of accumulated assumptions pushed humans to seek stability outside their own bodies. When timing and chance could no longer be relied upon, survival began to depend increasingly on something else. Not stronger bodies, not better genes, but shared systems that could hold continuity when the world refused to provide it. When human evolution is told as a story of survival, it is often framed as a solitary achievement. Homo sapiens are described as if they endured alone, separated from other human species by superiority or destiny. But this framing hides a crucial truth. Humans did not survive in isolation. They survived through contact, through overlap, through exchange. The evolutionary path that led to modern humans was not sealed, it was porous. As Homo sapiens moved across landscapes already inhabited by other human species, they did not simply replace them, they encountered them. They were a regular part of expansion. Other human species were not distant ancestors locked in the past. They were contemporaries, sharing time and space. This coexistence created opportunities that shaped human evolution in ways that cannot be explained by competition alone. One of the most important of these opportunities was interbreeding. Genetic evidence shows that Homo sapiens did not remain genetically isolated. They mixed with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other human groups that left no clear fossil record. This mixing did not occur because humans were seeking diversity. It occurred because contact was unavoidable. Groups met, interacted, and reproduced under conditions of proximity and pressure. Evolution did not prevent this exchange. It allowed it because the resulting offspring were viable. Some of the traits carried through this mixing provided immediate benefits under specific conditions. Others simply persisted because they did not interfere with reproduction. Importantly, interbreeding challenges the idea of a clear boundary between human species. These boundaries were not absolute. They were gradients shaped by geography and time. Humanity did not evolve through strict separation. It evolved through blending at the margins. This blending mattered because it expanded the range of variation available to the surviving lineage. At moments when Homo sapiens faced new environments, traits inherited from other human species could influence survival. These traits were not uniformly beneficial. Some affected immune response, others influenced adaptation to cold, altitude, or disease exposure. Evolution did not choose these traits deliberately. They entered the lineage through contact and remained if they did not cause immediate harm. This process added complexity to human biology rather than clarity. Modern humans carry fragments of other human histories within their genomes. These fragments are not signs of progress. They are records of encounter. They remind us that survival was not a clean victory. It was an accumulation of influences gathered along the way. Interbreeding also reveals how precarious survival truly was. When populations are small and pressure is high, maintaining strict separation becomes less important than continuity. Reproduction becomes a means of persistence rather than identity. Early humans did not preserve genetic boundaries out of foresight. They responded to immediate conditions. If contact increased the chances of survival, it occurred. Evolution tolerated the outcome. This tolerance shaped the modern human genome into something layered and uneven. Some inherited traits proved useful only temporarily. Others became neutral or even problematic as conditions changed. Evolution did not remove them once their context faded. It carried them forward. This is why human biology contains elements that do not align neatly with present conditions. They reflect past environments and past interactions rather than current needs. Understanding this reframes the meaning of human uniqueness. Modern humans are not the result of a single, isolated lineage refining itself toward perfection. They are the result of convergence, of lineages meeting, overlapping, and leaving traces in one another. Survival depended on openness as much as resilience. This openness was not a virtue, it was a circumstance. Boundaries between groups were permeable because they had to be. This permeability also undermines the idea that Homo sapiens succeeded by outcompeting all others directly. In many cases, survival involved absorption rather than replacement. Traits, genes, and behaviors flowed across groups. Over time, as other human species disappeared, their genetic contributions did not vanish entirely. They remained embedded in the surviving lineage. Homo sapiens did not carry forward a pure evolutionary path. They carried forward a composite one. This composite nature did not guarantee success. It increased variation. Variation increases the chance that some traits will align with future conditions. It does not ensure alignment. It only postpones extinction. Interbreeding did not solve the problem of survival. It redistributed risk across a wider genetic landscape. This redistribution helped Homo sapiens endure certain challenges longer than they otherwise might have, but it also tied their fate to inherited compromises shaped under conditions that no longer existed. The legacy of this process is still present. Human evolution did not select a single answer to environmental pressure. It layered multiple partial answers together. As we move forward, we will see how this blending shaped not only biology, but behavior, culture, and identity. The survival of Homo sapiens was never the story of one lineage standing alone. It was the story of many lineages leaving marks on the one that remained. The genetic traces left by other human species inside modern humans are often described as advantages, as if interbreeding provided clear upgrades that pushed Homo sapiens forward. This interpretation is too simple. The reality is more uneven. The genes inherited from other human species did not arrive as a coordinated package of improvements. They entered the lineage as fragments, each carrying its own assumptions about the environment in which it once evolved. Some of these fragments aligned briefly with new conditions. Others created tension. None were evaluated in advance. Evolution allowed them to remain because they did not immediately prevent survival. One of the most discussed examples involves immune response. Certain genes inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans appear to have influenced how early Homo sapiens responded to unfamiliar pathogens as they moved into new regions. In the short term, these genes may have increased resistance to local diseases, but immune systems shaped under one microbial environment do not always function optimally in another. Heightened immune reactivity can protect against infection while increasing the risk of inflammation and autoimmune response. Evolution tolerated this trade-off because the immediate benefit outweighed the delayed cost. Long-term consequences were irrelevant to selection. Similar patterns appear in traits related to climate adaptation. Genes associated with cold tolerance, fat distribution, and skin physiology may have helped some populations endure harsh conditions. Yet these same traits could become liabilities when environments warmed or diets changed. Evolution did not remove them once their original context disappeared. They remained embedded, interacting unpredictably with new pressures. This is why inherited traits from other human species do not map cleanly onto modern conditions. They reflect past alignments rather than present needs. Interbreeding also complicated development. Traits shaped in different evolutionary contexts do not always integrate smoothly. The human body became a mosaic of adaptations that had never evolved together before. This mosaic increased variation, but it also increased internal tension. Systems, optimized for one set of assumptions, had to function alongside systems shaped by another. Evolution did not resolve these conflicts. It layered them. As long as the combined system remained viable, the conflict persisted. This layering helps explain why some human traits feel contradictory. Strength and fragility coexist. Endurance pairs with susceptibility. Cognitive flexibility sits alongside emotional volatility. These contrasts are not accidents. They are outcomes of blended evolutionary histories, compressed into a single lineage. Interbreeding also affected behavior. Different human species likely had different social rhythms, communication patterns, and responses to stress. When populations mixed, behaviors did not merge seamlessly. Some patterns reinforced group cohesion, others increased friction. Cultural transmission smoothed some differences, but it did not erase them. Over time, certain behaviors persisted not because they were optimal, but because they were compatible enough to function within shared groups. Again, evolution tolerated imperfection. It did not seek harmony. The presence of inherited traits from other human species also reveals something important about the nature of survival. Homo sapiens did not survive because they carried a single, superior design. They survived because they accumulated variation faster than conditions eliminated it. Interbreeding expanded the pool of possible responses available to a population. When environments shifted, some of these responses aligned briefly. Survival depended on whether alignment occurred before collapse. Variation increased the chance of alignment, not the certainty. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Interbreeding did not make humans robust. It made them adaptable in the short term. Adaptability can extend survival, but it also increases complexity. Complex systems fail in quieter ways. Problems emerge gradually, often masked by compensatory behavior. This is why the legacy of interbreeding is difficult to interpret as either positive or negative. It did not push human evolution toward balance. It pushed it toward accumulation. Accumulation of traits, accumulation of assumptions, accumulation of unresolved interactions. What began as variation hardened into baseline. Traits once limited to certain regions or populations spread through migration and expansion. Their original context faded, but their influence remained. Evolution did not prune the genome to remove what no longer fit. It carried everything forward that did not immediately cause failure. This explains why modern humans carry biological responses that feel out of place. They are not mistakes introduced recently. They are echoes of environments and encounters that no longer exist. Interbreeding did not conclude the story of human evolution. It deepened it. It ensured that survival would depend on managing internal complexity rather than achieving simplicity. Homo sapiens did not inherit a clean slate when other human species vanished. They inherited a layered one. Each layer carried traces of a different past. As conditions continued to change, these layers would interact in new ways, sometimes reinforcing survival, sometimes amplifying vulnerability. The blending that once extended persistence would later become another source of tension. Human evolution did not converge toward clarity. It accumulated history inside the body, and this accumulation would shape every future response to a world that continued to change faster than biology could follow. When the last other human species disappeared, it might seem natural to assume that Homo sapiens finally reached a stable form. With no close relatives left to compete with or blend into, humanity appears, in hindsight, to stand alone and complete. But this perception is misleading. The absorption of other human lineages did not simplify human evolution. It destabilized it in quieter, more enduring ways. By carrying fragments of multiple evolutionary histories within a single species, Homo sapiens inherited not unity, but tension. Each absorbed lineage represented a different response to environmental pressure, a different balance of strength and vulnerability shaped under conditions that no longer existed. When those conditions vanished, the traits shaped by them did not vanish as well. They remained active, interacting inside bodies and minds that now had to function across entirely new contexts. This created a form of internal instability that evolution did not resolve. Instead of selecting one coherent strategy, human evolution layered several incomplete ones together. The disappearance of other human species also altered the meaning of identity. When multiple human forms existed, difference was visible. Boundaries were external. Once only one species remained, difference became internal. Variation that had once been distributed across lineages now existed within populations, and even within individuals. This made adaptation less visible and more diffuse. There was no longer a clear alternative way of being human to compare against. As a result, Homo sapiens began to experience their own variation as deviation rather than diversity. Evolution did not correct this perception. It allowed it to persist because perception itself does not affect reproduction directly. But the consequences were significant. Internal variation increased uncertainty about what was normal, what was stable, and what could be relied upon. Biologically, the blending of lineages meant that certain traits persisted without clear environmental justification. Some genetic combinations functioned well only under narrow conditions. When those conditions were absent, the traits remained dormant or became sources of strain. Evolution did not remove them because they did not consistently prevent survival. Over time, this produced a species with wide internal diversity but limited ability to recalibrate it. The human genome became a record of past encounters rather than a blueprint for future stability. Behavior followed a similar pattern. Cultural practices absorbed influences shaped by different histories. Some behaviors supported cooperation, others increased conflict. Without external alternatives, these patterns competed within the same social spaces. Evolution did not arbitrate between them. It allowed cultures to experiment rapidly, often at great cost. Stability became something humans had to construct actively rather than inherit. The absorption of other human species also intensified reliance on learning and imitation. Without parallel lineages exploring alternative solutions, Homo sapiens had to generate variation internally. Innovation became essential, not because it guaranteed improvement, but because there were no backups left. This increased the speed of cultural change relative to biological change. Culture began to outrun the body. Practices spread faster than physiology could adapt to support them. This gap widened vulnerability. Traits inherited through interbreeding were now carried into environments shaped by rapid cultural transformation rather than gradual ecological change. Evolution did not coordinate this acceleration. It tolerated it. The result was a species increasingly dependent on external systems to manage internal complexity. Tools compensated for physical limits. Social norms regulated behavior that biology could not stabilize. Stories, beliefs, and shared meanings provided continuity where genetic coherence was impossible. These systems did not emerge because humans transcended their evolutionary past. They emerged because that past was fragmented and unresolved. Interbreeding did not complete human evolution. It ensured that completion would never occur. By absorbing multiple evolutionary paths into one lineage, Homo sapiens inherited a history that could not be reconciled into a single, stable form. Survival continued, but at the cost of increasing dependence on non-biological structures to hold life together. This dependence did not eliminate risk. It transformed it. Risk moved away from immediate physical failure and towards systemic fragility. When systems fail, they fail broadly. The loss of other human species did not crown Homo sapiens as the final answer. It removed comparison and concentrated uncertainty. Humanity became singular, but not unified. The blending that once extended survival now demanded constant maintenance. Identity, biology, and behavior had to be managed actively rather than assumed. Evolution did not provide closure. It provided continuation under constraint. Understanding this completes the picture of interbreeding not as a moment of enrichment, but as a turning point where survival became inseparable from complexity. Homo sapiens did not carry forward the best of what came before. They carried forward what remained, and what remained was layered, contradictory, and unfinished. As human evolution moved on from this point, it would no longer be shaped primarily by biological exchange with other human species. It would be shaped by how a single, composite lineage learned to manage the consequences of carrying so many pasts into an uncertain future. Tools are often presented as the defining feature of humanity. Stone blades, controlled fire, crafted weapons, and later complex technologies are described as the moment humans became truly human. But this interpretation reverses cause and effect. Tools did not create humanity. They exposed its limits. Long before tools became sophisticated, early humans were already constrained by bodies that could not fully meet the demands of their environments. Weak jaws could not process all foods efficiently. Fragile skin could not withstand prolonged exposure. Limited strength and speed could not reliably overcome predators. Tools emerged not as expressions of dominance, but as compensations for these shortcomings. They were extensions of a body that could not solve problems on its own. The earliest tools did not make life easier. They made survival possible under conditions where the body alone was insufficient. A sharp stone replaced teeth that were no longer effective. Fire replaced fur that had been lost. Containers replaced digestive systems that could not extract enough energy from raw materials. Each tool filled a gap rather than adding strength. This pattern reveals how human evolution actually unfolded. Instead of redesigning the body to meet environmental challenges, evolution allowed humans to outsource solutions to the external world. This outsourcing did not reduce dependence. It increased it. Once a population relied on tools, survival became contingent on maintaining knowledge, skill, and access. Losing tools could be fatal. Forgetting how to make them could collapse entire groups. The body became less central as a self-sufficient unit. Survival shifted towards systems that existed outside biology. This shift did not signal mastery. It signaled fragility managed through external support. Tools also altered the pace of change. Biological evolution operates slowly, constrained by reproduction and inheritance. Tool use accelerates adaptation. A new technique can spread within a single generation. This speed created a widening gap between biology and behavior. Bodies evolved at one pace. Lifestyles changed at another. The human organism became increasingly mismatched with its own practices. Muscles, joints, and senses adapted over millennia, while tools transformed daily life within decades or centuries. Evolution did not correct this mismatch. It tolerated it because tools masked immediate failure. Pain, injury, and fatigue could be offset temporarily through technology. Long-term consequences remained invisible to selection. This masking effect intensified evolutionary dead ends rather than resolving them. Tools allowed humans to survive with bodies that were increasingly strained. They did not make those bodies more robust. Instead, they made dependence on external systems irreversible. Once tools became central to survival, abandoning them was no longer an option. The human lineage committed itself to a path where continuity depended on cultural transmission rather than biological stability. Knowledge had to be preserved, skills had to be taught, mistakes had to be minimized. Failure now carried collective consequences. A group that lost its tool-making traditions faced extinction regardless of physical capability. This reliance reshaped cognition. Memory, imitation, and attention became critical, not because they improved intelligence in an abstract sense, but because forgetting became dangerous. The human mind evolved to store procedures, sequences, and practices that extended beyond instinct, but this storage came with cost. Cognitive load increased, error potential multiplied. Tools solved immediate problems while introducing new vulnerabilities. A technique can be misapplied, a dependency can be disrupted. Evolution did not eliminate these risks. It shifted where risk was located. Instead of failing physically, humans began to fail systemically. A breakdown in tool use could ripple across survival strategies. This systemic fragility grew as tools became more complex. The more humans relied on external solutions, the less resilient the biological core became on its own. Understanding this reframes the role of tools in human evolution. They were not markers of advancement toward independence. They were signs of increasing reliance. Tools did not elevate humans above nature. They tethered humans more tightly to constructed environments that required constant maintenance. The body did not become stronger through tool use. It became more specialized for a life that assumed tools would always be present. This assumption was rarely tested successfully. Groups that lost access to tools often collapsed quickly. Evolution tolerated this vulnerability because the immediate benefits outweighed the risks under prevailing conditions. But the risks accumulated silently. Tools allowed human evolution to continue without resolving underlying biological limitations. They carried survival forward by postponing failure rather than eliminating it. This pattern will repeat as tools become more complex and central to life. Human evolution did not pivot away from its constraints through technology. It leaned into them. Tools did not complete the human form. They revealed how incomplete it already was, and as tools became inseparable from survival, they set the stage for a deeper transformation, one where cooperation, learning, and shared systems would matter more than any individual capacity, and where the boundary between human biology and human environment would become increasingly difficult to define. Once tools became central to survival, they did more than compensate for physical limits. They began to reshape the relationship between human biology and time. Biological evolution moves slowly, constrained by reproduction and inheritance. Tools move quickly, spreading through observation and imitation within a single generation. This difference in speed created a widening gap that human evolution never closed. Instead of bodies adapting to environments were reshaped faster than bodies could follow. Human biology remained anchored in conditions of scarcity and danger, while daily life increasingly reflected artificial stability created through tools. This gap did not remove pressure. It displaced it. Physical strain became less immediately fatal, but systemic strain increased. The body survived by relying on routines and structures it did not evolve to sustain independently. This reliance altered perception. Danger was no longer only something encountered directly. It became something managed through preparation, storage, and planning. Tools extended survival forward in time, allowing humans to act in the present for future outcomes. But this extension came with cost. The nervous system evolved under conditions where feedback was immediate. Hunger followed scarcity quickly. Injury followed exposure instantly. With tools, feedback was delayed. A mistake could take weeks or months to reveal itself. This delay increased uncertainty. Humans had to imagine consequences rather than experience them directly. The mind became occupied with possibilities rather than certainties. This shift intensified cognitive load. Anticipation replaced reaction. Evolution did not adjust biology to handle this prolonged uncertainty. It tolerated the strain because tool-based living reduced immediate mortality. Over time, this produced a species that could survive complex systems but struggled to feel settled within them. Tools also changed how failure functioned. In a purely biological context, failure is local. An individual misjudges a situation and suffers the consequence. In a tool-dependent context, failure becomes collective. A broken technique, a lost skill, or a disrupted supply affects many at once. Survival became tied to shared knowledge and coordinated behavior. This increased efficiency but reduced resilience. The more humans relied on tools, the more they depended on continuity of learning and cooperation. Evolution did not build redundancy into these systems. It allowed them to grow fragile. When they failed widely. This fragility was invisible during periods of success. It only appeared under stress. Tools also encouraged specialization. Different individuals became responsible for different tasks. This division improved short-term productivity but reduced individual self-sufficiency. A person no longer needed to know everything, but needed others who did. This interdependence deepened vulnerability. If coordination broke down, survival suffered quickly. Again, evolution did not reverse this trend. It accepted specialization because it improved reproduction under prevailing conditions. Long-term risk was not considered. Over generations, human life became organized around maintaining systems rather than maintaining bodies. Health depended on access. Safety depended on structure. Knowledge depended on transmission. The body alone could no longer guarantee survival. This dependence transformed identity. Being human became less about physical capability and more about participation in shared practices. Those excluded from systems were exposed. Those integrated survived. Evolution did not judge fairness. It preserved outcomes that worked temporarily. The acceleration created by tools also reduced opportunities for biological correction. When technology masked pain, injury, or imbalance, selection pressure weakened. Bodies that would have failed under earlier conditions now persisted. This did not improve biological design. It allowed flaws to accumulate. Tools acted as buffers, not solutions. They postponed consequences rather than resolving them. This postponement shaped the future of human evolution. Adaptation shifted outward, away from genes and toward culture. But culture changes faster than stability can form. Practices spread before their consequences are understood. Mistakes propagate quickly. Correction lags behind adoption. Evolution did not slow this process. It relied on it. Survival increasingly depended on the ability to adjust behavior rapidly, rather than refine biology slowly. This made human evolution more volatile, not less. Tools did not stabilize the human condition. They made it dynamic. They allowed rapid response to change, but increased the cost of error. This dynamic explains why human societies can expand quickly and collapse just as fast. The underlying biology remains fragile, supported by systems that require constant attention. When attention falters, vulnerability returns. Understanding this reveals why tools cannot be seen as a turning point toward control. They were a turning point toward dependence on speed. Human evolution did not become safer through technology. It became faster, and speed magnifies both success and failure. Tools allowed humans to outrun immediate limits, but they also ensured that those limits would return in more complex forms. This tension between rapid adaptation and slow biology would continue to shape every stage that followed, pushing humans to rely even more heavily on shared systems to manage a body that never fully caught up. As tools grew more complex, they did not simply add new abilities. They began to reorganize the entire structure of human life. What started as simple extensions of the body gradually turned into systems that no individual could fully understand or control alone. Survival became tied not to what a person could do, but to whether the surrounding system continued to function. This marked a subtle but decisive shift in human evolution. The locus of vulnerability moved outward. Instead of the body failing first, the system did. When systems fail, they do not injure one individual. They expose everyone at once. This is the hidden cost of technological dependence. Tools allowed humans to bypass immediate biological limits, but they also created conditions where failure scaled rapidly. A disrupted method of food preparation, a lost technique, or a breakdown in coordination could threaten entire groups. Evolution did not treat this as a problem to be solved. It treated it as acceptable risk because the short-term benefits were immense. Groups with better tools expanded faster, accessed more resources, and reproduced more successfully. The fact that this success rested on fragile structures was invisible to selection. The more humans relied on tools, the more they reorganized their behavior around maintaining them. Time was spent not only on survival tasks, but on preserving knowledge, teaching skills, and enforcing norms that ensured continuity. Culture became a stabilizing force, but it was a fragile one. Unlike biology, culture does not persist automatically. It requires attention. It can be forgotten. It can be disrupted by conflict, migration, or loss of key individuals. When culture failed, tools lost their power. The body, already adapted to tool dependence, could not easily revert to older modes of survival. This created a one-way dependency. Evolution does not favor reversibility. Once a lineage commits to a strategy that works, even temporarily, returning becomes unlikely. Tools locked humans into a path where survival assumed continuity of external systems. This assumption shaped future adaptation. Rather than strengthening the body to reduce dependence, humans invested further in technology to manage the risk technology created. This feedback loop intensified complexity. Each new solution introduced new points of failure. Over time, the human environment became increasingly artificial, designed to support bodies that could no longer thrive without it. This did not mean humans gained control over nature. It meant they exchanged one set of constraints for another. Natural pressures were replaced by systemic ones. Instead of predators and climate alone, humans now faced breakdowns of coordination, loss of knowledge, and cascading failure within shared structures. Evolution tolerated this shift because it still allowed reproduction. Comfort, stability, and resilience were not required. Continuation was enough. Tools also altered how humans perceived themselves. Mastery over objects created the illusion of independence, yet this independence was conditional. It depended on uninterrupted access to materials, skills, and cooperation. When those conditions weakened, vulnerability resurfaced quickly. The body had not become stronger, it had become more specialized for a life surrounded by tools. Muscles, senses, and endurance adapted to mediated environments rather than direct ones. Evolution did not reinforce self-sufficiency. It reinforced compatibility with constructed systems. This compatibility was brittle. It functioned well within familiar contexts and poorly outside them. The deeper the dependence grew, the harder it became to imagine survival without it. This narrowed perception further entrenched the path. Humans responded to fragility by adding layers rather than simplifying. Each layer reduced immediate risk while increasing long-term complexity. This pattern echoes everything seen so far in human evolution. Problems are not eliminated, they are managed through accumulation. Tools did not free humans from their evolutionary past. They carried it forward in new forms. Physical limitations became technological dependencies. Biological dead ends became cultural obligations. The result was not liberation, but transformation of vulnerability. Instead of being exposed to the environment directly, humans became exposed to the stability of their own creations. This exposure reshaped priorities. Maintenance became as important as innovation. Trust became essential. Coordination became survival critical. The human condition shifted from endurance of nature to endurance of systems. This shift did not resolve the fundamental mismatch between slow biology and fast change. It amplified it. Tools accelerated life, while bodies remained constrained. The tension between these speeds would continue to grow, shaping every future stage of human evolution. Technology did not complete the evolutionary journey. It redirected it toward a path where survival depended less on what humans were and more on what they could collectively sustain. This path offered extraordinary reach, but it rested on fragile foundations. And once committed, there was no simple way back. At a certain point in human evolution, survival stopped, depending primarily on physical strength or even technical skill. It began to depend on something far less tangible: stories, sounds, shared symbols. Language did not emerge because humans suddenly became wiser. It emerged because coordination had become too complex to manage through action alone. As tools multiplied and social groups grew larger, direct observation was no longer enough. Individuals needed a way to transmit experience without being present. They needed to warn others about dangers they could not see, plan for events that had not yet happened, and maintain cohesion among people who were not always together. Language answered these needs imperfectly, but effectively enough to persist. Words did not replace reality. They represented it, and representation carries power. Through language, humans could compress experience into signals that traveled faster than bodies. A story about a predator could move across a group instantly. A memory of past failure could shape future behavior without being relived. This ability reduced immediate risk, but it also altered how humans related to the world. Reality was no longer encountered only through the senses. It was filtered through shared descriptions. This filtering did not increase accuracy. It increased influence. Language allowed certain interpretations to dominate regardless of whether they were fully true. Evolution tolerated this, because shared belief often mattered more than precise perception. Groups that agreed on a narrative could act together. Groups that did not fractured. Cooperation became less about reacting to the same stimulus, and more about believing the same explanation. This shift had deep consequences. Once survival depended on shared meaning, symbols gained weight. Objects, gestures, and sounds began to stand for ideas rather than immediate functions. Fire was no longer just heat. It became safety. Territory was no longer just space. It became belonging. These symbolic associations stabilized behavior across time, but they also introduced rigidity. A symbol can persist long after the conditions that created it disappear. Evolution did not remove outdated meanings. It allowed them to remain as long as they supported cohesion. Over time, humans became increasingly guided by what things meant rather than what they did. This increased predictability within groups but reduced adaptability to change. Language also transformed memory. Instead of relying solely on individual recollection, humans externalized memory into stories passed between generations. This extended survival beyond the lifespan of any one person. Knowledge accumulated, but accumulation introduced distortion. Each retelling reshaped information slightly. Accuracy competed with usefulness. Evolution did not prioritize truth. It prioritized continuity. A story that motivated cooperation could survive even if it simplified or altered reality. This is why human cultures are rich in myths that persist despite contradiction. They function as tools for coordination rather than records of fact. The rise of language also intensified internal experience. With words, humans could label emotions, imagine futures, and replay past events mentally. This increased self-awareness, but it also increased inner noise. Thoughts no longer ended when action ended. They continued inward. Anticipation, regret, and abstraction became part of daily life. The nervous system, already shaped for vigilance, now had to process imagined threats as well as real ones. Evolution did not adapt the mind for quiet. It adapted it for responsiveness within social systems that relied on constant signaling. Language made humans better at surviving together, but worse at being still alone. Importantly, language did not make humans more honest or more rational. It made them more aligned. Alignment is powerful. A coordinated group can outlast stronger individuals, but alignment depends on shared assumptions. When assumptions diverge from reality, risk accumulates. Evolution tolerated this risk because the immediate benefits of coordination outweighed delayed consequences. Groups that could tell compelling stories expanded. Groups that could not fell apart. This selection favored influence over accuracy, persuasion over precision. Language became a survival tool shaped by social pressure rather than objective truth. Understanding this reframes one of the most celebrated features of humanity. Language did not lift humans above their evolutionary constraints. It rearranged them. Physical vulnerability was offset by social cohesion. Environmental uncertainty was managed through shared narratives. But the cost was internal complexity and susceptibility to collective error. Once survival depended on meaning, humans became vulnerable to meaning failing. False stories could persist. Harmful beliefs could spread. Evolution did not prevent this. It allowed it because belief itself had become a mechanism of survival. As language and symbolism took hold, human evolution moved further away from biological adjustment and deeper into cultural management. The body changed slowly. Stories changed quickly. The gap widened. Survival now depended on maintaining coherence between shared meaning and changing conditions. When coherence held, groups endured. When it broke, collapse followed. This dynamic did not end with the first words. It intensified. Language became the foundation upon which larger social systems would be built. Systems that could carry humans far beyond the limits of their bodies, but also far beyond the safeguards of direct experience. As stories and shared meanings became central to survival, they began to shape human behavior in ways that were both stabilizing and dangerous. A shared story can bind a group together across distance and time. It can coordinate action among people who never meet, but the same mechanism that creates unity also creates exclusion. Once survival depends on agreement, disagreement becomes a threat. This is not a moral failure. It is an evolutionary consequence. Groups that moved together survived better than groups that fractured. Evolution favored cohesion over nuance. They simplified complex realities into clear categories of belonging and danger. These simplifications reduced hesitation. They also reduced flexibility. When conditions changed, rigid stories lagged behind reality. But evolution did not remove them quickly. As long as they continued to support coordination, they persisted. This created a new kind of vulnerability. Groups could become extremely effective within familiar contexts, while growing blind to emerging risks. Belief stabilized behavior, but it also narrowed perception. Language amplified this effect by allowing authority to travel without presence. A leader did not need to be there to influence action. A rule did not need to be tested again to be obeyed. This efficiency increased survival in the short term. It also increased the cost of error. When a story was wrong, it could misguide many at once. Evolution tolerated this because correct stories were not required for persistence. A belief that coordinated action could outcompete a more accurate belief that fragmented a group. This is why human evolution favored persuasive narratives rather than precise ones. The environment did not reward truth directly. It rewarded survival under pressure. Over time, stories began to organize not only action, but identity. Humans started to understand themselves through narratives handed down rather than through direct experience alone. This created continuity across generations. But it also transferred unresolved assumptions forward. A story born in one environment could persist in another, where it no longer fit. Evolution did not evaluate stories against changing conditions. It evaluated their ability to maintain cohesion. When cohesion held, the story survived. When it failed catastrophically, groups collapsed. There was rarely a gradual correction. This all-or-nothing dynamic increased the stakes of belief. The internal experience of individuals changed as well. With language, humans could rehearse social judgments, imagine exclusion, and anticipate conflict long before it occurred. Acceptance and rejection became psychological realities, not just physical ones. The nervous system, already tuned for vigilance, now monitored social meaning constantly. Safety was no longer only about predators or climate, it was about belonging. Evolution favored sensitivity to social cues because isolation often meant death. This sensitivity did not turn off when threats subsided. It became chronic. Anxiety, shame, and self-monitoring emerged as byproducts of a mind shaped to survive within tightly coordinated groups. These experiences were not selected because they were pleasant. They were selected because they reduced the risk of social rupture. Stories also created a buffer against uncertainty. When the world was unpredictable, meaning provided structure. Even an incomplete explanation felt safer than none. This preference did not depend on accuracy. It depended on emotional regulation. Evolution favored beliefs that reduced paralysis and encouraged action. A story that offered purpose could sustain effort under hardship. A story that explained loss could prevent fragmentation. These functions mattered more than correspondence with reality. As a result, humans became adept at maintaining meaning, even when evidence was thin. This capacity extended survival, but it also increased susceptibility to collective illusion. Importantly, once stories became central, correcting them became difficult. Challenging a shared narrative threatened cohesion. Those who questioned beliefs risked exclusion. Evolution did not protect truth seekers. It protected group survival. This does not mean humans became incapable of learning. It means learning had to be framed in ways that preserved identity. Change occurred through reinterpretation rather than abandonment. Old stories were adjusted, layered, or symbolically transformed rather than discarded. This slowed adaptation when rapid change was needed. Again, evolution tolerated the cost because abrupt fragmentation was more dangerous than gradual mismatch. Understanding this reveals why language and belief are double-edged in human evolution. They allowed coordination at unprecedented scales, but they also created new failure modes. Collapse could now occur through shared misinterpretation rather than physical defeat. Survival depended on maintaining alignment between meaning and environment, a balance that was difficult to sustain. As human groups grew larger and more complex, this balance would be tested repeatedly. Stories would enable expansion, but they would also magnify error. The same force that held societies together could pull them apart. This tension did not resolve. It became a permanent feature of human life. As stories grew more powerful than direct experience, they began to outrun reality itself. What once helped humans coordinate survival slowly turned into a force that could reshape perception faster than conditions could change. This is where language stopped being only a tool and became an environment of its own. Humans no longer responded just to what happened around them. They responded to what was said to be happening. This distinction matters. A perceived threat can mobilize action as effectively as a real one. A shared belief can organize millions of people, even if the belief is incomplete or false. Evolution tolerated this because coordinated action mattered more than accuracy under pressure. But the tolerance came with cost. When stories drift too far from reality, they do not fail immediately. They succeed until they don't, and when they fail collectively. The stronger a shared narrative becomes, the more damage it can cause when conditions shift and the narrative no longer fits. Language amplified human reach, but it also amplified error. Mistakes were no longer local, they scaled. This scaling changed how collapse occurred. In earlier stages of evolution, failure usually affected individuals or small groups. With shared stories and symbols, failure could propagate across entire societies. A belief that once coordinated survival could later lock behavior into patterns that no longer worked. Evolution did not provide a safeguard against this. It continued to favor cohesion because cohesion delayed collapse more reliably than fragmentation. The result was a species capable of extraordinary collective action, but also capable of sustaining harmful assumptions far beyond their usefulness. This is not a flaw in intelligence. It is a feature of an evolutionary system that measures success narrowly. As long as a story keeps reproduction and coordination intact for long enough, it persists. Language also reshaped responsibility. Actions justified by shared meaning feel less personal. When behavior is framed as necessary, inevitable, or sacred, individuals experience less internal conflict. This reduces hesitation and increases efficiency. Evolution favored this reduction because hesitation can be fatal under threat. But the same mechanism dulls feedback. When outcomes are framed through narrative, failure can be explained away rather than corrected. Reality loses its authority. Interpretation takes over. This is how humans can persist in harmful patterns without immediate correction. Evolution did not design a system for self-critique. It designed a system for persistence under uncertainty. As language deepened, humans became increasingly detached from direct sensory grounding. Experience was filtered through explanation. The body felt something, but the story decided what it meant. Pain could become purpose. Loss could become destiny. Fear could become identity. These transformations allowed endurance under hardship, but they also blurred boundaries between internal state and external condition. Humans learned to live inside meanings that did not always correspond to their surroundings. This made adaptation more complex. Adjusting behavior now required adjusting belief, and belief is resistant to change because it supports belonging. Evolution favored belonging because isolation was dangerous. Challenging a story threatened social bonds. As a result, humans often change behavior only after collapse, not before. This dynamic explains why language did not stabilize human evolution. It intensified its volatility. Groups could grow large, organize quickly, and transmit knowledge efficiently. They could also misjudge reality at scale. The same narrative that supported survival in one era could produce catastrophe in another. Evolution did not prevent this oscillation. It allowed it because short-term survival was still achieved. Long-term balance was never the goal. Language did not free humans from evolutionary pressure. It shifted that pressure inward, into belief systems that had to be constantly maintained, defended, and revised under stress. By this stage, human survival depended less on adapting the body and more on managing meaning. Physical vulnerability had been supplemented by symbolic vulnerability. Bodies could be protected by tools and cooperation, but minds could be destabilized by stories that no longer fit reality. Evolution tolerated this trade because the benefits were immediate and the costs delayed. This tolerance locked humanity into a path where progress would always carry risk, and coordination would always flirt with collective error. Understanding this closes the arc of language in human evolution. Words did not elevate humans above nature. They allowed humans to build internal worlds that could either align with reality or drift dangerously away from it. Survival increasingly depended on keeping those worlds close enough to the truth to function without ever fully matching it. This balance was fragile. It remains fragile. Language gave humans reach, continuity, and coordination. It also ensured that when things went wrong, they would go wrong together. Human evolution did not find safety in meaning. It found momentum, and momentum, once built, is difficult to slow without consequence.